We've got a tight program, and so we must try and stick to our schedule. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to welcome here His Worship, the Mayor of the City of Johannesburg, Councillor Professor Harold Rudolph. You, like I, have heard a great deal about, in the last few months, about the city with a heart of gold. All I want to say, if there is somebody in Johannesburg with a heart of gold, it is certainly my very good friend, the Mayor. And he is a very distinguished member of the South African legal fraternity, a professor at the University of the Witwatersrand, a councillor of senior standing in Johannesburg, a man who's made impact on his own council and has made contributions over a wide range of affairs. And we're privileged to have him here this morning to welcome you here and to his lovely city.
Môre al, dis 'n bietjie vroeg nee, maar laat ek nou sê, besoekende burgemeesters en burgemeestersvroue, lede van plaaslike owerhede, geëerde gaste, dames en here. Dankie vir die vriendelike woorde waarmee u my bekend gestel het. Dis my voorreg as burgemeester van Johannesburg om namens die stadsraad en al ons inwoners 'n vriendelike en baie opregte verwelkoming terug aan al die afgevaardigdes by hierdie plaaslike bestuurskonferensie oor privatisering. Ek kan u verseker dat ons baie ononskik is en dit as 'n groot eer beskou dat u ons stad gekies het as die vergaderplek by hierdie belangrike geleentheid. I would like to extend a very special word of welcome to our two distinguished overseas speakers, Mr. Robert Poole and Dr. Madsen Piri. I know that everybody is looking forward with keen anticipation to the papers which they are going to deliver, and I say to them both that I trust that you will both have a very enjoyable and interesting sojourn in our vibrant city. Your visit takes place, as it has already been said, to a place in the heart of gold. It takes place to a city that is celebrating its centenary. Nou, dames en here, soos u weet, is hierdie konferensie gereël deur die stadsrade van Randburg en Sandton, as ook die Vrye Mark Stichting van Suidelike Afrika. En ek wil hulle komplimenteer met die ondernemingsgees wat hulle aan die dag gelê het deur tred te hou met die veranderings wat in ons moderne gemeenskap plaasvind. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference, focusing as it does on privatization in the local authority context, is of critical importance as it takes place against the combined background of reform, violence, and unemployment. The vigorous and extremely rigid constraints on local authority financing are well known, and the difficulties associated therewith are many and varied. It is the extremely important task of local authorities, particularly in the current South African context, to lend strenuous support to efforts to improve services to all of our peoples and to try and diminish the scale of ever-escalating costs. An enormous backlog of services and facilities exists in many areas of our country today, a backlog that must be eliminated as quickly as is humanly possible if we are ever to be able to break the apparently ever-increasing spiral of violence. Where sensible privatization can assist to achieve these aims, it must surely be encouraged and indeed welcomed by local government. The free market forces of supply and demand will then try to fill the gap that an over-regulated, super-heavy bureaucracy is unable to do. The central government is taking privatisation seriously enough to have formed a special cabinet committee on the matter under the chairmanship of Mr. Eli Lowe. And today's conference has made it possible for local authorities to demonstrate their interest in and commitment to privatisation. Privatisation is very much nowadays an in word, but in simple English, it merely involves the transfer of functions and responsibilities from the public to the private sector, leaving government at both local and national level free to concentrate on its real function, and that is of governing. Sensible privatisation, which is aimed at creating a balance between the market forces on the one hand and the need to protect the consumer, particularly in the South African context, is something that we should all strive to achieve. Probably much of the present-day problems that we are experiencing is due to the fact that we are, as a society, over-governed and over-regulated. There are today so many rules and regulations, so many boards and authorities, so much red tape, and so many unrealistically high standards that are applied on a far too rigid basis for the type of society in which we live, that much of the initiative for further growth and development has been and continues to be stifled. We must always remember that by stifling initiative and growth, we retard employment, and by retarding employment, we increase dissatisfaction, hunger, anger, and frustration. Of course, by doing that, we help unwittingly to promote the cause of unrest. Of course, at the same time, and that's why I've used the words sensible privatisation, at the same time we cannot throw overboard immediately all controls. And what we have to do is to proceed cautiously but with due and deliberate speed. The attendance at today's conference of so many people is an indication of the keen interest in privatisation opportunities for local government, and the presence of Mr. Poole and Dr. Piri will no doubt play a major role in the success of this conference. Dames en here, mag ek u almal alle sukses toewens met die baie belangrike beraadslagings. Ek het na die konferensieprogram gekyk, wat 'n besonder indrukwekkende lys van sprekers het. Die referate wat gelewer gaan word, gaan sekerlik prikkelend wees en lewendige besprekings uitlok. Daar gaan 'n aantal kwellende probleme bespreek word, en sonder twyfel sal die oplossings wat u geleerde sprekers voorstel, meebring dat die ver afstande wat sommige van u gereis het om hierdie konferensie by te woon, die moeite werd was. I want to express the hope that the conference will be one of great significance, and that the decisions taken here today will be wise and profitable to everyone concerned. South Africa is standing on the threshold of some extremely important and vital developments. Local government, which is intimate government, as it directly affects the citizen in his ordinary life, is at the forefront of these developments. And your deliberations here will be keenly watched by many who have the interests of this country at heart. May I conclude by wishing you every strength, much courage, and the greatest of wisdom for your deliberations. May your deliberations help to bring all South Africans, irrespective of race, sex, colour, religion or creed, nearer to each other, so that together we may build a better, a brighter and a more peaceful future for us all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my honor to introduce to you a man who in fact needs no introduction. Johannes Antoni Lombard, Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank. It's good to have him here. He is a man who is the very essence of somebody of Pretoria and from Pretoria. And we need to have that voice here. He matriculated there at one of the most distinguished Afrikaans medium schools in our country, and went on to the local university, where in due course he obtained his master's degree in economics cum laude before he went on to London, and that is where I first met him, where in 1954 he took a doctorate on a very learned a treatise in economics. He immediately joined the South African Reserve Bank, and very soon after that became involved in the Department of Industry and Trade. And almost immediately thereafter, he became a lecturer at his university, where in due course he became the professor and head of the Department of Economics. At a surprisingly young age, fortunately for us, he became an economic advisor to the then Prime Minister of our country, and has been in and around the corridors of power ever since then. He has served on innumerable commissions, is still an important advisor of our government, but we think of him particularly today as the President of the Free Market Foundation, and it is as such that we ask him to open this symposium. Dr. Lombard.
Baie dankie meneer die voorsitter vir daardie mooi woorde. Dis goed om ou vriende te sien. Ek het gedink ek is so oud dat ek al moet van die toneel verdwyn, maar as u my daaraan herinner dat u ook in daardie tyd saam met my die loopbaan begin het en u lyk vir my nog heeltemal goed vir 'n hele paar jaar, dan is ek in goeie geselskap. Meneer die voorsitter, aangesien van ons belangrike sprekers is hier wat van die buiteland afkom, gaan ek vanoggend die paar woorde wat ek te sê het in Engels sê. Soos Langehoven sê, ek glo nie Afrikaners het nodig om enige verdere advies te kry nie, dis miskien Mr. Chairman, today's detailed investigations of the possibilities of privatization of municipal services may be seen as part of a much broader philosophy of political economy, namely that of limited government. Actually, one should qualify that by referring to limited but strong government, limited in the spheres where it is not supposed to function, and strong in those spheres where we really rely upon it. So that should actually be the, let us say, the slogan or the hallmark of our deliberations, limited but strong government. The basic hypothesis is that the role of government and that of private enterprise in economic affairs can be clearly demarcated. There is a proper role for each of these two great institutions of modern civilized society. The roles are complementary and in that sense equally important. In our kind of society, ladies and gentlemen, government has no meaning without gainful private enterprise. And private enterprise is very improbable without orderly government. Mr. P.W. Botha, as Prime Minister of the Republic, made this a key point of his address at the famous Carlton Conference, this very building, with businessmen held, I think, in August 1979. Perhaps his thoughts were at that time not thoroughly understood by the bureaucracy if one sort of surveys the performance since then with regard to privatization and other aspects. But he has personally not deviated from that position, that government has its role to play and private enterprise has its role to play, and the two functions should not get mixed up, because rather than a mixed society, we will then have a mixed up society. In somewhat more abstract terms then, we are talking about the relationship between freedom, welfare, and order. The exercise of economic freedom is a basic function of private enterprise. The maintenance of the economic order is a basic function of government. And as all students of these matters know, freedom without order is impossible, while order without freedom is meaningless. I think one should, I might possibly repeat that because it sounds as somewhat rhetoric, but it really is very practical. There is no freedom possible without ordering the relationships between of the freedom among men. But simply to have order without freedom is really a meaningless exercise. But what of economic welfare? Why is it not primarily the function of government to produce economic welfare? Why do we regard this socially vital matter as primarily the function of private enterprise? Let us examine a little more closely what the idea of economic welfare means in practice. It means the facility to obtain scarce goods and services, like a house to live in, food to eat, clothes to wear, transport facilities, electricity, a telephone, sport facilities, etc. The list can obviously be extended endlessly, but these are the components of welfare. Are there any fundamental reasons why the production and distribution of these vital elements of economic welfare are not the function of government, but of private enterprise? There certainly are such reasons. The fact is that people normally produce much more under conditions of economic freedom than under conditions of economic bondage. When people are free to choose, they automatically try to maximize the value to themselves of the resources at their disposal. Only the perverse do otherwise. Some people may be dull at in this respect, and others will be bright. But in the final analysis, they all do with their time and their resources what they thought best at the time. And when their decisions turn out to be wrong, they learn by their mistakes. It is said, that all good decisions rest on experience, and experience is really learning from bad decisions. When people are free to choose, the learning curve is steeper over time. You learn faster, and you learn more. Private responsibility concentrates the mind on the really meaningful parameters. The manager who has to maintain a positive cash flow by his own efforts and not simply by taxing or otherwise coercing his compatriots to cover his expenses learns a great deal more that way. The managing director who must show a positive return to his capital by innovation and productivity rather than by convincing his board that his losses are really a brilliant strategy for meeting the basic needs of his customers learns a great deal more. When people are free to choose, innovators in economic affairs produce the best results. Innovators are, of course, born. They are not made by any particular system. You will find innovators in any system, and they are not necessarily unequivocally beneficial. You will find them in the bureaucracy, in the defense force, in the diplomatic corps, in the teaching profession or the medical profession. You will find them in a tribal system. You will find innovators anywhere because, as I say, they're not produced by the system, they are born. The innovator, as I said, can be a dangerous element of society if his freedom to choose, to experiment, to take chances is not properly guided and constrained by the system. And that's the function of the system. The best guides and constraints on the economic innovator are provided by the rules of the free market. Just as the best guides to the innovator in the medical profession are probably not produced by the teaching profession, but by the scientific principles of the medical profession. The best guides on and constraints on the economic innovator are provided by the rules of the market, for free market. The rules about risks, uncertainties and profits. The rules of the bureaucracy are simply inadequate to guide economic innovation among bureaucrats toward meaningful results. The cases of, ooblegooblee meters and white elephants and so on are well known. Sustained rapid economic growth is largely a function of innovation disciplined by the norms of the competitive market system. Well, while the processes of government are ill-suited to the production of most kinds of goods and services that constitutes economic welfare, government remains very necessary to establish, to maintain, and to protect the order within which private initiative operates, and to promote the provision of those basic services which will not attract private investment, because by their very nature they cannot command a market price. In these two fields, government has an indirect but a vital role to play in the production of economic welfare. But, Mr. Chairman, that as far as the philosophy and the rules of our South African system are concerned. The real question today, as we all sit here in this second quarter of 1986, is whether such a division of responsibilities between government and private enterprise is really suited to the economic problems that face the people of South Africa today. Neither the short-run cyclical nor the long-run growth trend of our economy gives cause for any satisfaction. Let's, be frank about this sort of thing. We have apparently reached the trough of the business cycle, but there is very little, if any, signs of an upturn yet. Even though our exports have been running at record high figures, there does not seem to be much of a domestic income multiplier at work. The multiplier seems to have fallen flat. Turning to the basic elements of the long-term growth pattern, the outlook seems to be equally grim. Investment in new productive capacity has been falling year by year throughout 1980. Somewhat shocking to have a look at the figures if you look over a long period of the trend that has been settling in. In the vital area of manufacturing industry, net investment, that is after depreciation, actually became negative in 1985. This is tantamount to a winding down of the economy. We are ourselves disinvesting in our own future. Had it not been for some expansion of mining for the world market, our growth rate would have even been more negative than it was last year. The poor performance in agriculture is understandable in the light of the prolonged drought, about which we ourselves can't do much, of course. But the depression in the level of our industrial and our commercial activity is mostly of our own making. And this must, be disconcerting to all of us today. The amazing fact is that South Africans have for most of the past decade been investing less in their own future than the resources available to them from their own domestic savings. This country has been a net exporter of capital to the rest of the world for several years now. And one can joke a lot about that, and it's pretty ironic, that we are at the moment financing the International Monetary Fund in order to waste that money in Latin America and so on. But I don't want to go into it more than saying that it must be very disturbing to all of us. On paper, the natural resources and the available skilled manpower, black and white, particularly the explosion of the availability of skilled black power in South Africa in the last 7 or 8 years is remarkable. Plus the available savings. You know, those resources can sustain an annual growth rate of close to 4% a year. Had this been achieved for the last decade, our national income now would have been 30% higher than it is at present. And you can make your own calculations what that might have meant in the form of further growth, in the form of actually lower levels of taxation than we have. And I don't have time to go into that sort of thing. But if our tax base today was 30% larger than it is, obviously the average tax rate could have been much less. Most people I talk to seem to be agreed that the problem lies in the extremely short horizons in the outlook of private enterprise in South Africa today. The short horizons of the private entrepreneur in South Africa. Investment for growth has become a function not of expected future demand, but of existing spare capacity. And that's not a formula for dynamic expansion. The question arising in people's minds is whether private enterprise in South Africa has lost its nerve. Has it capitulated? Is its role played out? Are we moving towards a depression due to the underutilization of our resources by private enterprise? And if so, but I'm not saying that it is so, I'm asking the question, but if so, what should government do about this situation? Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to attempt a full reply to that question. Moreover, my time is up, as you have indicated to me, haven't you? But I'm not going to attempt a full reply to that question today, although I expect that it will have to be addressed very soon. You know the alternative, ladies and gentlemen, as well as I do. Those of you who take pleasure in reading economic history must feel that you've heard exactly the same sounds coming up in the 1930s in the United States, in the time when Franklin Roosevelt, with the New Deal and what was called National Socialism in America in those days, emerged from this lackadaisical situation in the market. So you know the options as well as I do. Roosevelt style of socialism on the one hand, or Reagan style of supply side economics on the other hand. Do we ask for increased government expenditures to push the demand into the available capacity? Or do we look for the answer in lower taxes to improve the propensity to undertake risk? Or do we look for other reasons why the horizons of private enterprise is so short? You know, what is required to induce private enterprise to close the widening gap between opportunity and utilization? With that thought, Mr. Chairman, I now have great pleasure in wishing this conference well. Perhaps some of the answers might be found amongst your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lombard. We now welcome to the podium the first of our international speakers here this morning, Mr. Robert Poole, Jr. Mr. Poole was born in that charming small town right on the Hudson River on the New Jersey side overlooking New York City. He went to MIT, where he graduated as Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering, before going on to NUI, where he did postgraduate work. And then came the really important move in his life when in 1971 he became editor and general manager of the Reason magazine, a magazine which has had immense influence in the area that we're exploring here today. In 1978, that magazine was acquired by a newly created corporation, of which Mr. Poole became the chairman, and has been that ever since. At the same time, he became the chairman of the Local Government Centre, another initiative which has had immense influence in this area, also including the straight issues of privatization. He is, of course, today internationally known and acknowledged as an authority on these matters, and we are particularly fortunate that he is going to contribute here this morning and to consult with us on these many problems that will now be raised in these two key addresses. Mr. Poole.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I'm very pleased to be here in your country, and I hope we have a very productive day today exploring the ideas of privatization. I hope I can tell you and share with you many of the exciting things that have happened in the United States in this area over the past 10 or 15 years. Now, my own experience with privatization began 15 years ago when I became a consultant with local governments in the United States. And for 9 years, I traveled from city to city working on projects with different local governments. And I was amazed to find, as I went from one city to the next, that services were delivered in many different ways. What was taken for granted as the function of the public sector in one city, in fact, was provided by private enterprise in another city. And yet in each city, people assumed that their way of doing public services was the only conceivable way to do it. What I learned from that experience was that there is a variety of mixtures of public sector and private sector activity that can deliver the many types of services that we normally think of as government services. In fact, I concluded two specific things from this experience. One is that a great many, if not a majority, of what we call local public services can be produced by competitive private enterprise. Secondly, that most of these services can be charged for directly to the users, the people who get the services, whether it's refuse pickup or local transport services or whatever it might be. Now, once you realize those two factors, it means that there are at least 4 different ways of providing these public services, depending on who pays for the service and who delivers the service. The traditional form, the entirely governmental way, is that government collects taxes and pays for the service using tax money, and government is the deliverer of the service, the provider of the service. This is probably the way in which most of your public services here in South Africa are provided. That's only number one, however. Number two, which we call user fees, is the case where government does not pay for the service, but users pay directly, just as if the service were private, but government still is the service provider. This may be refuse pickup may be provided by the local authority, but people are sent a bill every month and directly pay for the service rather than the payment being made by tax payments. So that's a second form. The payment is private, but the delivery is public. The third form is perhaps the most common form of privatization, in my country, and that is called contracting out. In this case, government continues to finance the service through taxation, but hires one or more private enterprises on a competitive basis to produce and deliver the service. And this is very, very widely used, as we'll see later on today. And the fourth option is what we might call full privatization, in which both the financing and the delivery of the service are done privately. People pay directly to a private service provider, and the private service provider, of course, delivers and provides the service. And in this case, there may be one or there may be multiple providers, and if there are multiple providers, then consumers, citizens, have a choice of which one to use. So we can see that there is now quite a range of alternative ways of getting services delivered to the citizens. Now, these last two forms, contracting out and the full substitution of private enterprise, are what we normally speak of when we talk about privatization in America. The advantages that we have found by experience of privatization are that every time it's been systematically studied, we find that compared with traditional public financing and delivery of public services, that privatization tends to be better and cheaper, to use very simple terms. Now, we have both theory and practical evidence that demonstrates this. In theory, we have good reason to expect that a private enterprise system would be more responsive to the needs that citizens have as customers. Now, why would that be? It's simply the difference between competition and monopoly. If you're the provider of a service and you have a legal guaranteed monopoly that you are the only provider, the simple fact is that you are over a period of time, you're not going to care as much about how efficient you are in delivering that service, whether the refuse is picked up on time, whether some is spilled on the street, whether you use the optimum combination of people and equipment to do that job. You simply don't have the same incentive if your customers are guaranteed to you, no matter how you perform. On the other hand, if you have the possibility of losing your customers to someone else who can do a better and cheaper job, that concentrates the mind very strongly to say, you have to perform or you're going to be out of business. And it's that difference between the incentives provided by competition, the threat of not having the business unless you perform well, that simply does not exist generally in the public sector, where the service is provided on a monopoly basis with a guarantee of having the customers no matter what. Now, that you can see how that competition would work in the total privatization sense, where there are multiple providers paid directly by the users who choose to use them. But that even can be true in the contracting out situation, because there's competition there to be the provider of service. If the local government goes out to bid, out to tender every 2 years for a service provider to provide a certain service, whether it might be security patrols or fire protection or refuse pickup or street sweeping, then each firm that wishes to be selected must figure out how to do the job in a cost-effective way, or a better firm will get the contract. And then the winning firm has to perform during the life of that contract, do a good job, or it's not even going to get invited to bid when the contract comes up for renewal. So you do have a form of competition that produces the same kind of incentives in a contracting out situation that you have in a total privatization situation. Now, I also said the other advantage, besides being more responsive, is of being lower cost. And that is basically true for the same reason. The difference in incentives, when you're not guaranteed indefinitely into the future having the business, means that there is a strong priority on figuring out how to do the job efficiently, using the best combination of people, equipment, systems, and procedures, smarter than the other guy, in order to be sure that you get the business. Another reason, it also is more of an economist's reason, and that concerns the concept of economies of scale. you know that in any sort of productive enterprise, some sizes work better for producing things efficiently than other sizes. You don't produce automobiles in a backyard factory. You have to be large in order to have low unit cost in producing automobiles. Well, there are different economies of scale in different kinds of public services. Large-scale sewage treatment plant really only makes sense economically if it serves a large area, whereas something like refuse pickup can be economically sensible on a relatively small scale. And yet, if all services are provided by a local authority, on whatever the scale of size that particular local government happens to be, then the odds are that most of the services are not going to be provided at the optimum scale. Whereas, if private enterprise is producing the service, a private company involved in a business in which there are economies in being large can serve many different local authorities and obtain the advantages of economies of scale. On the other hand, if you have a service in which there are economies in being small, then multiple providers can serve one large city, each one being the optimum size. And so this is another reason why using private enterprise, you're more likely to get economical size of performance. Now, to what extent has this privatization that I've talked about actually occurred in America? Well, we had our federal government, Department of Housing and Urban Development, did a nationwide survey in 1982, 1983, because no one had looked systematically at how much privatization was going on. They surveyed all cities larger than 10,000 population and all counties, which are larger units of local government, which are larger than 25,000 population. And all across America, 1,800 local authorities responded, filled out the survey, and told what they were doing. We looked at 59 different types of public services, everything from ambulances to zoning services. And we found that out of those 59 different types, in 13 of those 13 types of public services, private enterprise actually predominated. Private enterprise was the majority provider in most cities. The leading cases of private enterprise provision were daycare services for children, which was provided by the private sector in 92% of all the local governments. Towing away of illegally parked vehicles, which was contracted out to private enterprise in 85% of the local governments. Community arts programs, privately provided in 73%. Mental health programs, privately done in 64%. And paratransit, which means specialized small-scale transit operations in 63% of all the local governments. Now, these figures surprised everyone. No one realized how rapidly privatization had been growing. There had been another survey somewhat like this 10 years before, and the levels that we found 10 years later, depending on which service you looked at, were 2 times, 3 times, sometimes 5 or 10 times as many local governments using private enterprise rather than providing the services themselves. The most important reason for this rapid shift to privatization has been the fiscal pressures on local governments in the United States. Some of you may have heard of the tax revolt, Proposition 13 in California, where I come from. Citizens got very upset in the 1970s about the high and growing level of taxes at the local level in America, and put through measures to restrain the growth of spending by local governments. And so this has provided a very powerful incentive to local authorities to find better and cheaper ways of getting services delivered. And so that's I think is probably the most important reason why privatization has moved so rapidly in our country. Now, this movement to use the private sector has grown, we can see 3 general stages through which it has evolved, each one being somewhat more complex and ambitious. The first stage has been local authorities contracting out their own, what you might call, housekeeping services. Things such as janitorial services in government buildings, cafeteria services in government office building, maintaining the streets, patching potholes in the pavement and so forth, trimming the grass in public parks, these sorts of things. These are routine types of services. They, for the most part, don't involve direct contact with customers, with citizens. The customers really is only the local government itself. And in almost all of these cases, the services can be provided by small local businesses, so that it was very easy to find suppliers. There were already firms doing janitorial services, doing tree trimming and grass cutting and so forth already in the private sector in their cities. Another aspect of this stage one was services that required some specialized expertise, such as operating computer data centers for the local government. In many cases, this whole function has been hired by a private computer service firm rather than the local government setting up an entire computer department. This started happening 10 or 12 years ago. And other specialized services such as engineering, city engineering services, or legal services, accounting services, many of these specialized expertise types of functions, especially for very small local authorities, were contracted out as well. So this is what constituted what we might call stage one. The next and more ambitious stage, which generally started happening a little later, was of either contracting out or divesting entirely to the private sector of services that are delivered directly to the public. Now, by this I mean such things as refuse collection, street sweeping, where citizens are directly seeing how clean are their streets, emergency ambulance service, the entire operation of parks and recreational facilities such as golf courses, even in some cases fire protection, and in a very few cases certain types of police services such as providing police patrol on public housing projects or in public transport systems and these sorts of things. Now, these were a little more ambitious privatization projects because the citizens were directly observing how good the service was, and many local authorities were a little nervous about having this direct kind of feedback from customers, but generally it's worked out very well. And in a few cases, services like refuse collection had been private anyway in some cities, even in the 1950s and 1960s. But what we have seen extensively in the 1970s and on into the 80s is a shift from a local authority picking up the garbage to hiring private firms, or simply the local authority getting out of the refuse business altogether and letting different firms in the marketplace be responsible for that service. Now, finally, in the last 5 years, we've seen the emergence of stage 3 of local privatization, and this has been large-scale projects for infrastructure that have been done entirely as a package deal by a consortium of private firms. Now, the areas where this concept has been applied includes resource recovery plants, which means taking garbage and refuse and deriving energy from it in very large-scale incineration plants, sewage treatment, wastewater treatment plants, of which we've had a great need for building new ones the last 10 years, public hospitals, which in many cases were losing money and run down and needed to be rebuilt, prisons, which has just started happening the last 2 years, and to a very limited extent, mostly talk so far, roads and highways. Now, the concept here is of a total package provided by a group of private firms. You'll have an investment banking firm that puts together a financial package to raise the large amount of capital required to build this new facility. You'll have perhaps an accounting or consulting firm. The big 8 accounting firms like Arthur Young and Arthur Anderson, Touche Ross have gotten involved in helping put these deals together. Then you have a major construction firm such as the Parsons Corporation or others that actually gets involved in building the project, designing it, building it, and then operating it on about a 20 or 25-year contract with a guaranteed schedule of what the prices are going to be for operating the service. So the private sector does the total job of raising the money, designing, building, and operating the facility, and usually in these contracts at the end of the designed or the designated contract period, whether it's 20, 25, or 30 years, the ownership of the facility reverts to the local authority. Now that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but that is the way it has worked in most of these so far. Now what makes these kinds of deals a good idea for local authorities is several things. First, private enterprise seems to be much more cost conscious in designing these facilities. A private prison firm, for example, tries very hard to use a design that requires the minimum number of full-time guard positions, because every full-time guard position, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, requires not one person on the staff, but 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how the hours of work go. And every one of those positions you can eliminate saves a large amount of money in annual payroll costs. Public sector could design that way, but generally they haven't. Private enterprise that's going to be operating the facility has a very powerful incentive to design it for the most economical operation. Generally, private enterprise has been able to end up with much lower construction costs because they can do these projects in about half the time that the typical public sector agency seems to take. Less red tape, more direct responsibility for making decisions, and so forth. Private enterprise generally has lower labor costs and much less generous fringe benefit packages than the typical civil service system, and so that also results in lower operating costs. And finally, at least in the United States, we have a provision for using tax-exempt bonds to finance these projects. Even though it's private enterprise that is running the project, still the financing can be tax-exempt, and so that also lowers the costs, puts that particular cost on the same basis as if the public sector did the project. So this has been the new stage now of these large-scale infrastructure projects. I mentioned we have theory that says privatization can be better and cheaper. We also have a wealth of practical experience. Critics of privatization can always find examples where something goes wrong and point to that and say, well, see, privatization really wasn't such a good idea. And advocates of privatization can point to a good example and say, see how good that was, it was better and it was cheaper. But that doesn't really settle the question. What you really need to do is have large-scale, objective scientific studies that examine hundreds or thousands of cases of privatization and look and see, on average, do these things really work? And that's exactly what we now have in the United States. We have quite a number of objective scientific studies. One which I'll talk about, actually two, which I'll talk about in the session later today, session 3 on refuse collection. We've had 2 nationwide studies on private versus public refuse collection, and those have shown overwhelmingly that private enterprise refuse collection is lower cost for the same level of performance. We'll talk a little more about that later. Just last year, a very large-scale study on public works operations was completed by a consulting firm under contract to the federal government's Department of Housing and Urban Development. It looked at 8 different public works services in Southern California where there's a lot of privatization. And in each one of these 8 services, the researchers looked at 10 communities that had private enterprise providing the service under contract, and 10 different cities that had that provided the service themselves using government employees. And here in very quick summary is what they found. For maintaining street trees, trees along the sides of streets, which are maintained usually as a public responsibility, government provision was 37% more costly than private enterprise provision, comparing 10 cities with one, 10 cities with the other. For street cleaning, government provision was 43% more costly than private enterprise. For lawn maintenance in public green spaces, parks and others, public government enterprise was 43% more costly than private enterprise. For maintaining traffic signals, government was 56% more costly than private enterprise. For building maintenance, janitorial service in public buildings, government was 73% more costly than private enterprise. And for asphalt paving, government was 96% more costly than private enterprise. So we have now some very powerful objective studies in the same part of the same state of California, of cities that are approximately the same size and age, In other words, all the variables are basically held the same except for the variable of does the public sector or the private sector do the service. These results are very, very strong and very, very hard to quarrel with. We've had several other studies in areas like fire protection that also show that in those relatively small number of cases where we have private enterprise fire protection, that the service has turned out to be better and cheaper than when provided publicly. There are many, I'm running out of time for this introductory session. There are many questions that are raised by opponents of privatization, such as will it really cost more because of the cost of administering contracts, the perhaps hidden costs that might emerge later on. These large-scale scientific studies have tended to show that those fears just don't pan out. There's the question of will there be corruption in the awarding of contracts? In other words, will people make payoffs to get selected as the private provider? And that is a very real danger. That's something that you open the door to when you go to doing business on a contract basis. One answer to that, we have many handbooks and sample contracts and sample bid specifications and procedures in America that are guides for local government of how to do it right, how to have everything be so visible to the public that it greatly minimizes the opportunities for corruption and payoffs. And there has not been any significant problem. There have been examples, but it's been a very minor problem in the United States to date. The other way of eliminating the problem of corruption is simply to go to full privatization. If local government simply gets out of a particular field and leaves it to private enterprise, then there's nobody to be paid off. I mean, if citizens themselves choose which provider they have, there's no opportunity for a public official to be bribed to have one firm rather than another be selected, because it's consumers themselves who are doing the selecting based on performance. The other concerns are that privatization will take away the jobs of public employees, and this has caused some opposition in the United States. There are many techniques for dealing with this, such as, for example, requiring that the winning bidder on a contract make all of his initial job offers to the public employees who would be displaced. And these problems can be minimized and in many cases overcome entirely by provisions of that sort in making the transition. Another concern is that there aren't enough suppliers, and this is why it's been very wise in the United States to start with small-scale projects, services like janitorial services or grass cutting, where there are lots of small businesses already in existence that can do the job, and then move on as you get experience with writing contracts and administering contracts to larger services where you might be dealing with major companies, even perhaps international, multinational companies that are in business in some of these fields, like major infrastructure construction projects and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that we've learned over 15 years of experience now in the United States with the rapid growth of privatization. And the research center that I head, the Local Government Center, has made a point of systematically studying, collecting information, and serving as a resource to local authorities throughout the United States on what has been learned, how other local governments have handled the problems. We have on a computer 27,000 listings of specific services that have been privatized somewhere in the United States. And this is tremendously valuable to other local authorities, because if they're considering privatizing a particular service, they can find out which of their colleagues in other communities have already had experience with that enterprise, and they can ask them questions and get information and learn how well they've done. We also publish a monthly newsletter giving news on privatization. We serve as a clearinghouse for journalists so that reporters who want to write stories about privatization can also come and learn. So from all of this experience, I can conclude that privatization has proved to be an extremely viable option for local governments. It has helped local authorities in the United States to cope very well with less of a growth of tax revenues, and it's going to help them even more the next few years as our national government under great pressure of huge budget deficits, reduces the amount of tax money that is funneled as aid to local authorities. This new fiscal crisis, I think, will be coped with very well because privatization is already there as a mechanism to save money. Thank you very much.
Mr. Poole, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we now hear of the experience in the United Kingdom on privatization from Dr. Matson Peary, who is a Scot by birth. He was educated at the University of Edinburgh and at the University of St Andrews, where he first of all took the degree of Master of Arts Honours in History, and then obtained the Doctorate of Philosophy. While he was in that area, he was actually a member of the City Council of Edinburgh, and he served on committees of that council, such as health, transport, libraries, and museums. In 1974, he relocated to the United States of America, first as a research associate of the Republican Study Committee on Capitol Hill. He was then responsible for a syndicated column in the Freedom Group of 30 newspapers in the United States. And then in 1979, he became associated with the Adam Smith Institute as president, which he is today. He has to his credit a tremendous range of publications. He is well known on the lecture tour circuit. He is, if I may put it that way, in the same league as Mr. Poole, as an international authority on the subject, and we welcome him to the podium.
Thank you very much. The news about Britain, which I read overseas, seems to be, on the whole, bad news. I read in the papers abroad of new disasters striking Mrs. Thatcher each day, and it's almost quite a relief to go home and find that she's still there. I see that overseas it is the big sales in Britain which make the big news. We privatize firms like British Petroleum, and that gets into the foreign press. And so you read about BP and British Aerospace, the privatization of Jaguar cars and telecom, the privatization of the ports and the docks, cable and wireless, the radionics industry, the freight industry in Britain. All of these make news overseas. Indeed, when I am abroad, I always read the papers very carefully. I've been away a couple of days already, and who knows what else they might have privatized. But no less impressive in Britain is the record of privatization at local government, although this makes not nearly so much news in foreign countries. It is less interesting to foreigners, but it is no less impressive in its total. And those local government areas are the ones I will intend to deal with this morning. Let us take, for example, housing in Britain. The privatization of housing in Britain totals more than all of the other privatizations that I have mentioned added together. In terms of the gross revenues to the public sector by the sale of housing, state-owned housing, sold to its tenants, it comes cumulatively to more than all of the industries and utilities added together at £12.2 billion, which is nearly 40 billion rand, since 1979. Now that is something which is happening every day. It is cumulative, but it doesn't make instant and sensational news in the foreign press. The technique for this housing was a very simple one. We had in 1979 roughly one-third, 35% of our country lived in housing owned by the government, paying rent to the government. That is 35% of the total housing stock. They lived in these houses as tenants at subsidized rents, at below the market cost, and for the most part, on average, the dwellings cost more to repair each year than was actually taken in rent revenues. a situation familiar, I am sure, to many local governments all over the world. Previously, political attempts had been made to raise the rents of those houses to more economic levels. Not surprisingly, the people who lived in them resisted these attempts. Given a choice between paying economic or market level rents and paying cheap or subsidized rents, they preferred the latter. And any attempt to raise the rents to economic level would always meet with political pressure, rent strikes and protests from the tenants. The Thatcher government introduced the principle of discounted sales. That anyone who lived in, we call them council houses because they're for the most part owned and administered at the local government level, but anyone who lived in one of those council houses would be entitled to buy it, and if they had lived in it for 2 years, they would be entitled to 20% less than the market price. So a fair market price was assessed and an immediate 20% reduction, rising up to 50% off the market price if you'd lived there for 20 years. I might add that these discounts have now risen to 70% off the market price. In other words, you are faced with a government determined to get rid of them at all costs. The record to date is that 929,000 people have bought. That is Monday's figure. I checked it before I came. By September, it will be 1 million. 1 million people in Britain will have become homeowners as a result of this program. That is roughly 1/5 of the total, 20% of the people who lived in those houses. Moreover, it was quite difficult at first because the law in Britain makes it very difficult to buy rented accommodation. And most of the council houses is in the form of a dwelling of apartments and flats rather than actual houses. And in Britain, if you are living in an apartment, the law was extremely difficult for outright purchase. We used to buy them, used to buy leases. Well, that law has now been changed so that rather more flats will be sold, and the rate of sale has increased. We found one curious byproduct, that when people bought their own houses, there is every indication that they changed the way they vote in elections. The second big effect of local government privatization has been in the field of local government services. This started with the very progressive borough of Southend in Britain, which in 1980, at the end, privatized its garbage, refuse collection and street cleaning service at an immediate saving of 40%. They were followed very rapidly by other similar boroughs, privatizing in the first instance their garbage collection, but gradually moving on to other areas of local government service. First of all, the maintenance of public parks, the sweeping of the streets, maintenance of street lights, security and cleaning of public buildings, the contracting out of catering and cleaning services. It has now moved on to the professional services, computing, the services of town planners, lawyers, architects. There have been very interesting progress made in several counties on the privatizing of welfare services, the care of juvenile offenders, the care of dependent old people have been privatized. The situation is now that we calculate that each working day, some council in Britain somewhere privatizes yet another service. It extends into every area of local government operations, and it is gradually rolling onward by example. The savings normally fall into the range of between 20 and 40%. We are always surprised if less than 20% is saved, and agreeably surprised if it's more than 40%. This is a purely empirical figure. It just seems to hit that range. And I note from Bob Poole's figures in the United States and from privatization of local government services in Germany that a very similar range is encountered apparently all over the world, that you expect privatization to achieve savings in the range of between 20 and 40%. And it should be borne in mind that we are here comparing the cost of performing a service by government versus the price which must be paid when the private sector does it. When I talk of savings between 20 and 40%, I mean that is what the local government will save by paying the price of a private sector operation instead of the cost of doing it themselves. When we are asked to give advice to local governments in Britain about how to achieve savings, we tell them the first thing to do is to stand up in the council chamber and say the word privatisation. That will save an immediate 10%. As if by magic, their local government employees will come forward with all types of savings, hitherto undiscovered, ways of performing the operation more efficiently, and it is enough to say the word to achieve those results. If, however, as well as saying the word, they go on to do the deed, they will save at least another 10%. They will enter the 20 to 40 range. But the effect of privatisation in Britain is, in a sense, concealed by the figures. For many of the local governments which have not privatised have achieved savings through privatisation. And you might list, for example, the number of local authorities in Britain which have privatised their refuse collection service and never realised the hundreds of others for whom privatisation has saved money, even though they finally made the decision not to go that route, that they achieved the savings within their own department by threatening to go that route. So we reckon that the private sector can achieve those savings, firstly because of competition. You are choosing between firms bidding against each other. They make, in general, better use of labour. This is done in two ways. They employ better management techniques in the private sector. There is more pressure for them to do so, and they employ usually more modern and up-to-date equipment, vehicles and machinery. Also, it provides, privatisation that is, provides an opportunity to rewrite labour agreements that have sometimes built up over many decades. We find that the private sector operation at local government brings a better service and better control by the local authority. Paradoxically though it may seem, once the local government officials revert to the role of quality inspectors, managers and overseers, they can achieve a much better control of the service than ever they could when they were coping with the difficulty of managing their own workforce. We have learned several lessons which I think it would be useful for other countries to learn the easy way, that is, by looking at our mistakes rather than insisting on repeating them for themselves. First, we find it very important when a service is put up for privatisation to have some kind of pre-qualification among the firms which bid. It's no good simply inviting private tenders and then picking the lowest, for you will find yourself with firms which are simply incapable of doing it. And it's very useful to go to the two stages, firstly of inviting the bids, and then having your management team conduct an analysis of those firms and work out which of them are actually capable of doing it, and then with a smaller number going forward to the final bidding process. There was a case in England, for example, when one local authority invited a contract for cleaning all of the windows of its schools and public buildings. And one local window cleaner, who had a bicycle, a ladder and a son, and I believe 2 cloths, put in a bid for the contract and won it because his bid was lower. And after 3 weeks, when I think he'd got the first school finished, they decided to appoint another firm instead. They could have saved a great deal of difficulty by conducting an examination to make sure that the firm was physically capable of performing the work they had bid for. The second lesson we learn is that the contract must be very detailed. It must spell out in quite some close print exactly what is required of the contractor, what standards are required, what frequency of service, what level. This can be done the hard way by having each local authority sitting down in the attempt to work out what levels of service are required. The easy way is for them to simply buy it from another local authority. And we found that first city, Southend, made quite a profitable little sideline of selling the 100-page contract they had drawn up for privatising their refuse service. Other local authorities found it easier to buy that contract and adapt it to their own purposes rather than go through the process of trying to think it all up from scratch. It is useful to have penalty clauses written into contracts so that in the event of a default, a fine will be levied automatically if the service is not provided to the required standard. These penalty clauses will reassure public critics. It is also sometimes useful to have a performance bond posted, so that with particularly important types of service, there is money in escrow waiting to recompense the local authority should the work not be performed to the required standard, or should the firm go bankrupt and there be a hiatus before another firm can be offered the contract. And if there is money in the form of a performance bond waiting to be used for that purpose, then considerable problems can be avoided. It is useful sometimes to have local participation. That is, it's not uncommon for a local authority to reserve perhaps 20% of the business for local small firms. And instead of simply taking branches of national firms, which have local subsidiaries, to deliberately reserve a proportion of the business for building up local businesses. It's highly significant. 3 weeks ago, we privatized one of our shipyards called Vickers, a very famous shipyard, and we took the second highest bid. The highest bid received was from an international conglomerate. The second highest bid was one which involved the management, the workforce, and members of the two communities in which the ships were built. And the British government correctly took the view that the privatization would be more likely to be successful and enduring if all of those people were involved in the process. And so it accepted the second highest bid in terms of money in order to get the best one in terms of the future. There are some rules we have developed in privatizing city services which might be useful in other countries. The first rule is, if possible, don't fire anybody. That is, if the local government task force is to be displaced by private enterprise, contrive to do it in such a way that no one loses their job involuntarily. In some cases, this will involve paying sufficiently generous sums to encourage early retirement. In other cases, as Bob Poole said, it might involve writing into the contract that local employees of the council should be given the first opportunity at the new jobs which open up by the successful private firm. Always, there will be some people displaced. If you are running the service with 100 employees and you privatize it, the odds are that the private company will be able to perform the same task with perhaps 80. And those 20 who do not get jobs with the private employer should not be fired, but reabsorbed elsewhere into the local government administration by not advertising jobs externally. This means that instead of recruiting people from outside, you use those 20 and redeploy them elsewhere. If you fire anybody, however small the proportion, everybody will think that it could be them, and you'll face the opposition of the entire workforce and their families and their supporters in the community. If you follow a policy of privatizing without firing anybody, you will not meet with that opposition. People will be reassured that their jobs and their position are safe, and therefore they have no reason to oppose or thwart the privatization process. The second rule is, if you have made agreements, honor them. That is, if you have various pension agreements which have been reached, they must not be cancelled unilaterally. If people have received a benefit and are expecting its continuation, and you do not propose to continue it, then you must compensate them. And so we, for example, when we move workers to the private sector, as Bob Poole says, sometimes things like pension agreements or fringe benefits are not as high. They must be compensated for that change. The employees of British Airways, which we are going to privatize sometime this year, were receiving index-linked pensions in the public sector, tied to the rate of inflation. Well, there's no way that a private company could accept that kind of unlimited liability, so we had to buy out those pensions. And we did it not by cancelling them or reneging on the agreement, but by offering sufficiently generous sums that they freely surrendered those pensions for the more realistic ones that the private sector offers. It's done voluntarily. The exercise of privatization, to be done successfully, requires you to identify all of the interest groups involved in the process. That is, the management of the bureaucracy which supplies and delivers the service, the workforce whose livelihood is earned from delivering it, that part of the public which receives the benefit, and it may often be a subsidized benefit. They perceive themselves as beneficiaries, And if there is a proposal to interrupt or discontinue the service, they recognize their potential loss and form a potential lobby group against it. So you identify systematically all of the interest groups involved in the process and construct the privatization package so that none of them lose. The management, for example, in many cases in British local government become the management team of a privatized operation. We sometimes take the whole local government operation and privatize it, as it turns into a private company. And the management board become the new board of directors. That happened in the case of Telecom. It's happening in the case of British Gas. The workers are very often allocated shares in the company, and so it becomes a kind of worker cooperative. They become participants involved in the profit-making ability of the company to compensate them perhaps for the more secure position they enjoyed in the public sector. The principle is to identify all of the groups and to make sure they have at least as much advantage in the new operation as they had in the old. You will see that there is no such thing then as a simple policy of privatization. I think that is the reason we have been so successful in Britain and why it has been so widespread. It is not a simple formula, like hand it to the private sector or sell it off. If it were, we would have failed. We have to look at each case individually as a distinct operation, find out where the interest groups are, what their interest is, and construct the policy to benefit them all. When we privatized Telecom, for example, a very large public operation in Britain, we did so compensating the management team, compensating the workforce, the general public who received the shares, who received the service, were given reduced prices on their phone bills for 3 years if they became shareholders. We wrote into the privatization law that the new company was required to maintain a certain number of payphones in remote areas, that its flexibility on prices was limited for 8 years. All of these laws were carefully written into the package. So by the time it reached the market, there was hardly anyone left able to object to it, because everyone had been dealt with systematically. And the result was a huge success for privatization. But it wasn't an accident. And that kind of operation takes a lot of homework, and no less at the local level than at the national level. Well, the policy is complicated. Each case is different, how much more different than from one country to another. But the principles are the same. And the principles are such that privatization will create more opportunities for local business. It will give the individuals more choice. It will create chances for enterprise in either a sagging economy or a depressed part of the country. And it will give people a greater freedom as to how to spend their own resources. It also, as an incidental, enables one to lower taxes. And those local authorities in Britain which have proceeded furthest with privatization have been able to hold down their property taxes. We call these rates. And similarly, although the British government on the national scale faced a loss of many billions of pounds owing to the fall in oil revenues and the oil revenue it derives from the North Sea, it was nonetheless, in its budget last month, able to cut income tax despite that loss because of the privatization program. In Britain, it's now equivalent to 4% of the income tax. That is, instead of lowering the income tax by 1 penny, the government would have had to increase it by 4 pence on the basic rate, had it not been for the privatization program. You see, it works at national level as it works at local government level. Well, my message today is that the world is doing it. Britain had an early lead in privatization, but in America, especially at the local government level, privatization is proceeding very rapidly. Other nations of Europe, France is now embarking on the privatization process. It's happening in Bangladesh and in Malaysia. It's happening in Japan. Communist China and Cuba are both following the British-style privatization of public housing. It's happening in Korea. It's happening in Sri Lanka. The message seems to be that privatization is not something which works in one country. It seems to have tapped general principles which are true for mankind, and it will work in South Africa as it has worked elsewhere. So my message is, come on in. The water is warm, and the rest of the world is already bathing.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that you will now understand why these two gentlemen were in fact the key figures in the recent international conference on privatization, which was held in Washington. And you will also understand why Mr. Poole has been the White House consultant to the Reagan administration on privatization, and why Dr. Perry is sometimes called the architect of Mrs. Thatcher's privatization and deregulation program, and why he is such a close aide of hers. I'm happy to tell you that some of the standard reference books written by these two gentlemen on the subject are available in our country and can be obtained here. Now, I'm under strict instructions, ladies and gentlemen, not to let the question time of this session extend into the next session. And I simply want to point out to you that there is a microphone in the center aisle, and that in the other two aisles there are radio microphones, and two young ladies are standing by at the head of each of these aisles. You see these two young ladies, and will take the radio microphone speedily to any person who puts his hand up. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got our Dr. Jan, sit you down. We've got our two speakers at your disposal. We have a maximum of 10 minutes, so please let us proceed. A gentleman over there, could you help him, please?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, there is one aspect which I find rather disturbing. There seems to have been a propensity to gloss over the question of transferring a government monopoly or a public sector monopoly to a private sector monopoly. I was rather surprised some time ago when I read that of the 200 biggest companies in the world, with a turnover in excess of 6.7 billion RON, South Africa had 3 companies and came 5th. There were 103 in America, 37 in Japan, and then the United Kingdom and Germany were the only 2 other countries in the world that had more than three companies in the club of the 200, as it is called. And I'm rather frightened to think that although at the beginning there might be a saving, once the big sharks have swallowed the small companies providing the services, we might have a private monopoly which will boost up the prices, and where the poor consumer would have no say at all in fixing prices. Thank you.
One thing we make very sure of is that that is not allowed to happen. Firstly, in the case of privatization of services when it's done by contract, the solution there is short-term contracts of 2 or 3 years. And if a firm does start behaving as you suggested, then it will very rapidly lose the contract to one which is more competitive. On the question of privatizing these big national monopolies, although not strictly the concern of local government, we have developed a battery of techniques for dealing with it. In the case of telecom, for example, which some would argue is a natural monopoly, we used all 3 of the techniques devised to deal with it. The first is peripheral competition, where even though it is impossible to get a competitor of the same size and power, nonetheless, telecom faces one competitor for the supply of equipment, another competitor for business telecommunications, another one for satellite transmission, another one for computer data transmission, and in each of its markets it faces one competitor, all of them different, all of them smaller, but together they conspire to give it a hard time. The second method we use is that of writing into the Act in advance all of the requirements that we need to have met so that it cannot abuse its monopoly power. People said a privatized telephone system would never maintain all of the remote payphones in country areas because they don't pay. So we wrote into the Act a requirement that it did so, and anyone who bought telecom shares knew what they were buying. So the second method, public liability, we follow. The third method is the combination of a public monopoly turned private and a regulatory body whose function is to promote competition, and we did that with telecom. And we have a body called Oftel, whose function is, whenever the opportunity arises, to promote competition to it in any of its markets. So we've developed a battery of techniques. We are even prepared to privatize a monopoly. Next year we're going to privatize the water industry in Britain. And it will be privatized as a virtual monopoly. And we will use all of those techniques, and probably some new ones we've discovered between now and then, to make sure that it cannot abuse its position.
Gentleman over there.
Mr. Chairman, West End Development Board. Two questions. The first to Dr. Curry, and that concerns privatisation of housing. In this country, approximately 300,000 houses are being privatised to the black people. The principle adopted has worked very satisfactorily. In other words, the house virtually being given away at a price of approximately 1,000 as against a market value of 10,000. I feel that policy should be persisted with, and there is some opposition. Now, you've got very successful efforts in the United Kingdom. Could you please comment further on that, whether we should persist with that in the view of pressure from certain sectors that the house should be privatized at market value? In other words, whether discounts should be continued. The second one is to Mr. Poole in regard to the situation, particularly in Brooklyn. There, the problems arose as a result of subsidies because of the votes, the tying of subsidies to people who want to stand for Congress. Now, the only way in which I feel this can be overcome is to assess every subsidized house or tenant on an economic basis, and then to leave the onus on the tenant to prove that he is no longer in that category. If you do it in any other way, everybody lies to you, the tenant as well as his employer, because they want to help each other. And that is the only way. The situation in this country at the moment is that a very large percentage of people who are very well in a position to pay are all being subsidized, whether a person is a millionaire or not. Now they are, I feel, riding on the backs of people who should really be helped. In other words, the handicapped people and the underprivileged. Could you comment on that?
Yes, continue with the programme. It sounds like an excellent one. It's worth disposing of these houses at well below their market cost, because in many cases what you are giving away is a bill. In many times it costs more to repair them each year, especially if you count the administrative cost of rent collection, which many government authorities are reluctant to do so. And what you end up giving away is a bill. Secondly, you get, shall I say, a desirable social attitude when people own a stake in the country, when they have a piece of property. This is a social good. Thirdly, we find in Britain that the life of the housing stock doubles. Identical houses on opposite sides of the street. One person buys the house, the other remains a state tenant. The lifespan of the private house is doubled, because once a person has a substantial capital value in the house, they will look after it. And when a window breaks, instead of harassing the local authority for 2 weeks to repair it, they fix it themselves the first day because it's their own money they're protecting. Oh yes, continue it.
It's correct that there is a difficulty in some of these programs in properly identifying who qualifies for a subsidy and who doesn't. In the United States, we are starting to use the income tax records for those sorts of differentiations, and it's controversial because of people's concern about privacy of their tax record data. But my own view is that it's probably essential to use that kind of information in order to sort out who properly is eligible for subsidized benefits, subsidized housing, and who is not. Now, if I understand your question, I think you may also be referring to cases where people become eligible for something like subsidized housing or a low-cost loan for a house, and then may later on have an income level that is beyond what was necessary, can turn around and sell the house at a large profit. This is a problem that hasn't been completely solved in the United States, but the mechanisms that are being used concern things such as if the sale takes place within a certain number of years and the person is no longer eligible for the program, there's a sharing of the gain on the house with the local authority, and the individual, so that people, otherwise you might well get people simply making themselves eligible for the low-cost subsidized house, turning around right away and selling it at a large profit at market value, and obviously this would just drain resources from the public sector that were intended for a good purpose. So there are mechanisms, resale controls for a limited period of time that provide for equity sharing, that sort of thing.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that's about the time that we have at our disposal. Die burgemeester van Germiston is reeds hier om oor te neem en ek wil u graag vra om ons twee sprekers te bedank deur u hande bymekaar te sit. Which one? Bless you. Nice to see you.
Whilst the speakers are finding their way up to the dais, may I take the opportunity to welcome you all most heartily to this very important second session of this very important conference on privatization. In saying welcome, it's indeed a privilege and an honor for me to be here this morning, and especially to notice amongst the crowd of the guests and speakers here today some of my very old friends, which takes me back to the years when I was associated with Cape Town University, trying to lecture to some of these guys, and later on in the early and late 50s to teach some of them some rugby. I might say with great success. Just before we carry on, there's an urgent message for Mr. Clive Stewart from Pim Goldby to please contact the registration desk, and also Mr. B.J. Pretorius of SATS. He must please phone Mr. Engelbrecht, number 0415202000. We are running behind time, and I've been asked to announce that when we do take tea, it'll be limited to 20 minutes. I must please appeal to you to stick to that very rigidly. Our first speaker this morning in the second session on the title Professional Municipal Engineering Services by the Private Sector will be by Mr. Eric Hall. And in order not to take up too much time, I'm not going to take too much of your time in introducing the speakers. Mr. Eric Hall is a well-known personality in the engineering world, and all that I can say about him is that at the moment he's a consultant with De Leeuw Cather and Associates. He's a former city engineer of Johannesburg, and he's also a former past president of the South African Institution of Civil Engineers. And I will confirm my remarks today purely in English for the benefit of our overseas visitors. Maar vir die van my Afrikaanse vriende wat twyfel het oor my Afrikaans, ek wil net vir u verseker dat ek kan daardie taal ook besig. Meneer Eric Hall asseblief.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, by way of a brief explanation, as you will see from the program, this is to be a joint paper between Gil Murray and myself. We tried to prepare our ideas, he being in Pretoria, me in Johannesburg. We got together and we found in the end we'd prepared two papers. And when we found the limitations of time with this very long program, Gil very magnanimously said that I should do the presentation. Fortunately, he is here to field all the difficult questions in his particular field. If there's anything good in what I have to say, it's probably his ideas, the others are mine. I'm afraid there is going to be quite a lot of repetition. I've been listening to the overseas speakers with great interest, and a lot of what I have to say they have already said much better. I'll try and skip over those parts but I think it's at least, if I have something to say, I should say it. If I didn't repeat anything, I'd say nothing. But I think it's just as well that you hear it with a South African accent. I'm going to join the group down here for overhead slides. Is it working now? Thank you. The lights can come down a little. Very briefly, from the title, there are two important points I'd like to make. I'm talking about professional engineering, the stress on professional, and I'm also talking about service. By service, I obviously mean high-level service to local government. I am not going to cover the wide field. I'm narrowed down specifically to professional engineering. There are others who are going to follow the other fields. The number one thing is that the service that is required to provide the services which are necessary in a local government in any conurbation require the highest level of professional engineering input if they are to be provided effectively and efficiently. The resources we have in this country are limited. Privatization, I must say as an aside, I had difficulty with first thing in writing this paper. I didn't know how to spell it. I opted for the S. I hope Bob will forgive me. This is nothing new. We have used private sector expertise and resources virtually from the beginning. The big point is, do we make the optimum use? We have, of course, the current opportunity with a major change in the structure of government, and particularly local government. We have the potential of regional services. Incidentally, I was extremely disturbed to read in the Provincial Gazette yesterday the extent of what is proposed for Pretoria Regional Council, which extends from Brits to Bronkhorstspruit. I must admit, from the engineering point of view, I had never contemplated trying to consider services being provided effectively on such a broad and varied area, which has areas of high density and many areas without any development or virtually no development at all. We know, as we have heard this morning, that it is national policy, for very good reasons, to privatise, and clearly the time is now opportune. A word on professional engineering. Too often this is not understood. One looks naturally for technical competence. One looks for also competent management of resources, the resources being the traditional 3 M's, men, money and machines. More lately, we are aware that the professional engineer must be in a position to be aware of the implications of his works and his policies. It is not only for him to know how a thing should best be done, he has to know why, and he has to know what should be done, and he should make his views known. And it is that level that I am making my comments. I'm not looking purely at a technical service. In a word, we now talk about holistic engineering, which is becoming a well-used word, and by that we appreciate that the engineer's job, in effect, is to modify the existing environment. He uses materials and he provides the facilities which create an environment which is necessary for the continuation of our social existence. And if we take all these considerations, which certainly involve the modification of the environment into account, we get true professional engineering, true holistic engineering. And that is the basis. Present practice in the Republic, professional engineers are employed to design specific projects, sometimes to supervise construction. They are used for planning in certain fields, in particular transportation, solid waste, wastewater, preparation of development plans. I'll mention only a few. The traditional attitude, summing up, is to favour in-house work. There's a tendency to expand their capacity, the in-house expertise. There is a tendency to use the private sector to lop off the peaks when there's too much work and there are not enough hands available in-house to do it. There's an unfortunate tendency to give extremely limited briefs. This comes back to the professional engineering. The tendency is to say, do this, and not what do you think should be done. There's an obvious tendency to retain interesting work in-house for their own staff, and it may be summed up by saying that professional engineers are very generally used on a needs-must basis. Here we get very much the repetition. Many of the things that I like to mention are the possible gains. I think I should like to make one point very clear, because though I'm a bit out of reach, the chairman may reach me and pull me off in a moment or two. But I would like to make it clear that polarization between the public and private sector is the last thing we should have. And the tendency to stress the advantage of privatization, I fully support. But at the same time, I think we must be aware that there is a tremendously good service which is given and which should continue to be given in-house by the private authorities, by their own staff. And I think we should always bear in mind that not everything should be privatized. I'll make some suggestions here, but quite obviously it depends on local circumstances. The first thing one gets is budget control. One knows when one goes out how much it's going to cost, so one has control of the spending. Management information, the job is specified, it is done, whatever it might be, whatever service is required, at a particular cost, so that for the future, the local authority knows what that actual cost is. There are no hidden manipulations. I've no doubt there are many town and city treasurers present, but they are past masters at that. Specialised skills, these are limited in this country, and one has the benefit of getting specialised skills. If a professional engineer has done a particular service in one town and perhaps followed a learning curve, obviously that expertise could well be used by town B, and the same learning curve does not have to be followed again. There's a flexible capacity. There is a larger total body. One has a form of scale effect. The work being moved backwards and forwards is more able to cope than if one has two separate units. Accounting, once again, if one gets a monthly bill, one knows exactly what the costs are, and it's extremely simplified accounting that comes from this particular field. Competition. By competition, I do not specifically mean competition within the ranks of the organizations in the private sector. I'm thinking of the fact that the in-house costs can be compared, hopefully, with those doing it outside. Rapid action, that speaks for itself. One can call upon private enterprise at short notice without having to appoint staff. The same for costs of equipment. If one's thinking of going in for computer-aided drafting, perhaps materials laboratories, they can be immediately available. A touchy one perhaps is public opinion. The municipal engineer and municipal employee is usually regarded, I'm afraid, as a low form of life who does not perform much, is not productive, and is well overpaid for not doing anything. However false that is, and that concept is, I'm afraid that it does exist. And the fact that the private enterprise is brought in will usually, if properly handled as we've heard this morning, lead to a good opinion and support from the public. Is a question of improved local authority planning. If the senior people are not involved in administration of work being done in-house, they are relieved and have that time to do their planning. Question of efficient management. I'm not suggesting that the private sector is specifically more efficient, but certainly one is able to get management information and the specific costs. I had the problem, I mentioned it very briefly in Johannesburg some years ago, but I found the costs of in-house road construction were rising very much more rapidly than the costs outside. And eventually found out that the Treasury Department, without any reference unfortunately, had decided that all the overhead in-on costs, which included the operation of the whole roads and works branch, all the overheads were being transferred to departmental jobs and nothing to the outside sector. Those are the sort of things which happen in a complex system of accounting, and it's extremely difficult to know what true costs are. And the other one, particularly if one's thinking of regional services, one can expect that there would be more impartiality from a private firm rather than perhaps a core city of an area was to act as agent. To be fair, I've got an equal long list. Mr. Chairman, how are we for time?
Another 2 minutes,
Let's cut out about 15 slides. Disadvantages, very, very briefly. Not all of these mean that this is a reason why privatization should not be followed, quite clearly. But the point is that these are areas and aspects which have to be addressed. We've already had many of them mentioned and solutions from our overseas speakers. The loss of the local authority capability, quite obviously, if work's given out, they don't often increase staff, they're not able to do it themselves. The responsibility of the local authority, they can delegate work, they cannot delegate the ultimate responsibility that they retain. The question of private monopolies has already been mentioned. Profit factor has already been one thing that has probably been in the minds. The private sector can only operate if it makes a profit. And obviously, in order to do that, it's got to be efficient. And quite clearly, it must be sufficiently efficient in order to cover the profit and still be at a lesser cost, as we have heard, is the general case in many countries. Reduction of staff, we have heard that, and we've heard methods of overcoming that. Loss of flexibility. If one has specified a particular job to be done for a particular consultant perhaps, and then it is necessary to change it, it's sometimes more difficult to change it in terms of an agreement and a contract. So that is a point that has to be looked at. Specification of tasks, it's something which we don't usually do, and it's something which has to be done. Monitoring, obviously the work has to be monitored. The question of corruption has already been mentioned. There's also the basic resistance to change, and there's the question of the level of service. If private enterprise finds that it's losing, there's a tendency to try and cut the level of service, which of course is quite unacceptable. It's just some of the dangers we'd have to look at. Very briefly, we'll require guidelines. We'll have to look at the specification of task or function, how that is to be done, the method of selection and appointment, and here I specifically do not think professional engineering should be subject to bids. There are arguments for and against, but I think that the cardinal concept should be in all our minds the more you pay for good professional engineering, the greater your savings will be. To try and save on the design, to try and save on the professional engineering input is inevitably going to lead to greater costs in the end. Accountability, how the work is to be covered, the question of how the monitoring is to be done, the period of the agreement we've had mentioned, the question of penalties, and also provision for termination and how the job will complete. Were you serious about that 2 minutes, Mr. Chairman? I'll skip very briefly through some of the fields because those which especially lend themselves to regionalisation, which need professional engineering input, they will be dealt with in more detail by others, and I'll just go through very briefly. Solid waste requires special management dimension. You've already heard of it. Ray Lombard will be speaking later. It's a neglected field, being neglected by the engineers. It's one which we are realising requires very high level engineering input, and it lends itself to regional service, certainly as far as controlled landfill goes. I won't mention the other point because of time. Perhaps without going through the slides, I should just mention the fields. One thinks of transportation engineering, one thinks of traffic engineering, the question of roads, wastewater has already been mentioned, water supply, many areas where one requires high sophisticated expertise. One requires, for instance, in the field of water, that the consequences are known. I'll mention very briefly one example. One of my predecessors, the late Dr. E.J. Hamlin, the city engineer in Johannesburg, around about the war years, decided that it was necessary to provide additional purification capacity in the north of Johannesburg. And with his vision, instead of going out at that time a couple of miles, he went out some 28 kilometres to the side of the Northern Works on the basis that he said the expansion of Johannesburg is going to be a little north, and that area cannot develop unless there is proper sewer system. So in effect he recommended and got the council to agree to put in a regional sewer system. Without that, Sandton and Brandberg would not exist today. That area would not have developed. It's just the sort of thing that one gets from a professional engineering input. I think I'll jump very briefly to Chairman in my summary. Number one thing is we have a limited resource. It's found in both sectors. We must use it to the full. We must find the optimum use. No polarization, please. We must use all the expertise that is picked up and the private sector can serve to carry it from one city, from one region, one province to another. We must facilitate holistic planning, regional planning. There's a capability of meeting peak demands, and then the spin-off, which is so important. By raising the engineering service, which we can do by incorporating our total resources, we can raise the level of service, we can expand our expertise, and from the engineering point of view, I can assure you what's extremely important, we can perhaps make this field so attractive that we can bring in new recruits into the area. The other comments I will leave to later, hopefully, Mr. Chairman. Sorry if I've gone over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I'm sorry that I had to cut you short. May I just mention that the co-author of this paper, Mr. Gil Marais, was the founder member of the firm G.H. Marais & Partners. He's the chairman and executive of the firm, developed the firm into its present organization with offices in Pretoria, Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town and Verwoerdburg. He's associated with 8 professional relationships and 11 papers has been published since 1976 to 1984. Our next speaker, unfortunately, Mr. Conroe, had to withdraw in the last minute. and we have the pleasure of asking Mr. Kees Lagai, who's standing in for him. Kees has been, as you all know, for the past 14 years, been the Executive Director of the South African Federation of Civil Engineering Contractors. I have great pleasure in asking Kees to present the paper and to please try and finish up by about 10:30. Thank you.
Dank u, meneer de voorzitter. Mr. Roux, who was going to deliver this paper, is of course the past president of the Federation, still an executive member of the Federation, and he's been heavily involved in the Federation's privatization efforts over the last few years. His views, of course, correspond with those of the Federation, and I have no hesitation in delivering this address on his behalf. Of course, as we progress in this conference, Mr. Chairman, more and more of what we want to say has already been said by previous speakers, so perhaps we can progressively reduce our addresses as well. We deal here specifically at the moment with the construction and maintenance of civil engineering services, and perhaps for those who are not too familiar with this industry, unfortunately the word civil engineering is not all that descriptive, but we deal here with, in the first place, I would say, road construction, maintenance of roads and freeways and bridges, right down to parking areas and township roads. The next area of civil engineering construction, of course, is railways, harbours and aerodromes, and not too much of that perhaps in the municipal field, but certain aspects of this are performed in the municipal field as well, like municipal sidings and perhaps a few municipal aerodromes. Two important areas, certainly in the local authority field, water supplies, where the civil engineering industry, of course, is involved right from the construction of dams to pipelines, reservoirs, water reticulation, and water purification works. In the other direction, if I may put it like this, Mr. Chairman, sewerage and effluent treatment, reticulation, main outfall sewers, effluent treatment plants, and so forth. Previous speakers have mentioned those activities as well. Finally, Mr. Chairman, in the public utility field also, power stations, the structural side of power stations, mainly the field of ESCOM these days, but still there are municipal power stations as well. Mr. Chairman, therefore, generally, civil engineering work deals with the country's infrastructure. We see in South Africa the situation that the state spends about, state at all levels I'm talking about, spends about 3 billion rand a year on infrastructure, maintenance and construction of infrastructure, and we have a situation that about 60% of that work is by contract, but not less than 40%, 1.2 billion overall, is done by the state itself. The departmental units, in-house units, direct labor, whatever you like to call it, of government departments, South African Railways, sorry Mr. Chairman, provincial roads departments and local authorities. We feel that percentage is too high. How has this situation developed? I think for historical and other reasons we see a situation in South Africa that the state has always played a major role in the development of the economy, both from building railway lines and roads right down to the establishment of ISCOR. However, over the last perhaps 10 years or so, we have seen an increasing questioning of this role of the state, and more emphasis being placed on the role which the private sector should place. Right in this room, the 1979 Carlton Conference, the then Prime Minister, now State President, made certain announcements in that connection, which Mr. Roux quotes in this address, but reference has been made to that previously already. Yet, Mr. Chairman, it is very distressing that despite this increasing emphasis on privatization, right up to the appointment of the Cabinet Committee on Privatization, certainly in the field of civil engineering construction, the position has not changed one iota. Why is this? Perhaps two main reasons, Mr. Chairman. There's the question of principle and there's the question of practice, I would say. Not everybody agrees with the increasing role of private enterprise. Overseas we see this reflected perhaps in the political systems, with private enterprise parties on the right and parties in favor of socialism and communism on the left. Perhaps we should have a similar system in this country. Insofar as my federation is concerned, Mr. Chairman, our overall view in this connection is that insofar as the overall planning and conceptual design of civil engineering works, the kind I've referred to, is concerned, here we see the role of the state We feel that the state is in the best position to determine where a new harbour should be built, where a railway line should be constructed, and where whole new towns should be established. So very topical in the light of the new urbanization policy, of course. Beyond that one, the detailed design, planning, actual construction, we feel is the role of the private sector through the consulting engineer, the architect, and the private contractors. As I say, not necessarily everybody agrees with that view. At the practical level, Mr. Chairman, I think we have encountered a certain amount of resistance in the public sector. Two kinds of resistance. First of all, there's always the argument, I think it's been mentioned this morning as well, the public sector feels that they can do the work cheaper. Now, unless one gets proper management, accounting and information systems and proper codes of accountability, these exist, these can be prepared. I've got an Australian document here, I've got a British document here. These types of codes and accounting systems can be developed so that instead of comparing apples and pears, one can really start working out what the relative costs on both sides of the fence are. I think that's an important aspect of this whole exercise. Secondly, of course, Mr. Chairman, in the public sector, let's face it, there are vested interests. Departmental units have been established. Obviously, people involved are not always that keen to reduce these activities or even dismantle some of these units, and Dr. Peary mentioned the point as well, individuals may be threatened insofar as their livelihood and future is concerned, a very important aspect which we have certainly given a lot of attention to in the Federation as well, as to how this would be handled within our local privatization efforts. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Roux elaborates here as to why the private sector is more efficient. I think the points have already been mentioned by previous speakers, so I can probably glance over it. There are the elements of competition, the profit motive. Mr. Roux also mentioned the question of the right to hire and fire employees, which we certainly consider in the private sector to be an important aspect. But overall, we feel that this creates a greater flexibility, more innovation, better efficiency, and in the end, a system of construction, civil engineering works which are not only in the interest of the industry itself, but the country as a whole. Mr. Chairman, insofar as case studies is concerned, which actually is the item on the agenda, I think, it's difficult to give specific examples insofar as the situation in South Africa is concerned, because, as I say, we haven't really made much progress in the practical fields, a lot of words so far, but not many deeds. On the other hand, we have heard from Robert Poole and Dr. Peary about the experience overseas, and we certainly feel that this should be implemented locally as well. Coming down to some practical aspects, Mr. Chairman, because many of our discussions have boiled down to the question, while there may be a commitment, while there may be a willingness amongst certain public sector authorities to privatize, one comes across certain very practical aspects. First of all, Mr. Chairman, we are not looking for an overnight solution. We feel definitely that there should be a phasing-in period during which it can be established what work should be privatized, what activity should remain with the public sector. Because there again, in civil engineering construction, particularly in the maintenance field, dealing with emergencies, there are certainly activities which we agree could best be handled by the public sector themselves. So this is obviously a matter which requires much further investigation. A particular point, Mr. Chairman, which we would like to make as far as the advantages in the public sector is concerned, instead having to set aside large funds to maintain or to finance the departmental units, both capital expenditure budgets and operating budgets, because the units are there, public authorities, local authorities could actually budget for the new works they want to have constructed in a particular financial year and the maintenance which has to be carried out. So you get a far more flexible system. Also, the points have been made, Mr. Chairman, by using the contract system, the tendering system, by and large, you know the costs in advance, rather than these costs creeping up on you in the course of the project. However, work under contract, Mr. Chairman, there are some corollaries to this one as to how this should work efficiently. First of all, as has been mentioned, project will have to be properly described and needs proper specifications. The site where the works have to be constructed must be properly investigated, because the more uncertainty there is in a tender situation, the higher the price will be. The better the investigation, the less problems you come across afterwards. A second point in this connection, Mr. Chairman, The bogeyman of monopolies has been referred to. Well, certainly in my industry, civil engineering construction, I don't think you can find a more competitive industry in this country. Large number of contractors. I think the contractors here will agree we have a little bit too much competition at times, Mr. Chairman. So I don't think we have a danger of monopolies in this industry. Certainly, Mr. Chairman, still coming back to the question of tendering, we in the Federation certainly agree that the lowest tender is not necessarily the best tender. There is perhaps a tendency amongst local authorities to place too much stock on this question of the lowest tender. But certainly the tender prices must be seen in connection with the actual organizations which are tendering. Whether one uses a system of pre-qualification for major projects or approved list of tenders has been practiced in the South African Railways Transport Services for many years, or other approaches, but certainly this is of course an important aspect of the situation. The window cleaner with one man certainly would not necessarily put in the best lowest tender. Mr. Chairman, some other practical steps when there is an intention to privatize certain local authority services, and in the local authority field, Mr. Chairman, I quoted the overall public sector expenditure on civil works earlier on. In the local authority sector, we are talking about 1 billion rand a year on maintenance and construction of civil engineering works. Here I would say, Mr. Chairman, the situation is even worse. Only just over half of that is done by contract. Nearly half of it, 46%, is done by local authorities in-house for the various reasons we mentioned earlier on. Certainly we feel that this is not a situation which is in the interest of the country. In fact, however you look at it, Mr. Chairman, we certainly think that this is a very socialistic feature of the South African economy, and from our Federation point of view, which by definition of course is in favor of private enterprise, we feel that this situation should be changed. If one looks at the possible programs which could be implemented in individual authorities, each authority should set a target date, a period over which a certain amount of its construction activities, maintenance activities should be privatized to a minimum level, from our point of view, at least an appropriate level of work, as I say, emergency work, certain maintenance work, which the authority should continue to do. Insofar as the plant aspect of privatization is concerned, local authorities have plants. Such plants could be sold off. Such plant could also be operated until the end of its economic life. Where shortages would develop, one would expect the authority not to buy in more plant, but to hire, if necessary, plant to complete projects or put the remainder of the project out to tender. As far as staff is concerned, Mr. Chairman, there we agree that this is in a way the whole key of the operation. We have heard Dr. Peary say that staff should not be fired. Certainly we realize that certain arrangements will have to be made here. Some staff may be prepared to move over to the private sector. In fact, a large percentage, considerable percentage of our senior and middle management and other employees in the contracting industry have come from the public sector, Mr. Chairman. Private sector is not such a bogey situation as some of the public sector servants may believe, but certainly we feel there is scope for a certain percentage of staff to move over. There may be opportunities for moving staff sideways to other departments in the local authorities, or for staffing the maintenance units of these authorities in future. There may be an opportunity for early retirement, and the fourth aspect which we are also looking at, Mr. Chairman, that it could be made a condition of tender that certain staff which does not want to move across to the private sector should be seconded for the duration of contracts on the basis of their conditions of employment in the public sector. These are some of the thoughts that have been developed or are being explored, and this is obviously an area where more has to be done, but this is a very important aspect of the whole privatization campaign. In the field of maintenance, Mr. Chairman, this is an aspect which is often raised as whether maintenance is suitable for privatization. Here I think one can certainly make the immediate distinction between major maintenance, major resurfacing of roads, for instance, and minor maintenance like street patching or clearing of water lines, sewage lines and so forth. somewhere in the middle is a line to be drawn as to what activities should be privatized and what activities the local authorities should continue to do themselves. Mr. Chairman, skipping through this document, I just want to quote Mr. Roux in his last paragraph. As a person with some 40 years of road building experience in both the public and private construction sectors, he is firmly of the opinion that the economic future of our country will be materially improved by greater participation of all population groups in private enterprise, and particularly from our point of view, of course, in the construction of civil engineering works. Mr. Roux appeals to all those in the public sector to set the ball rolling for privatization of such municipal services as lend themselves to it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lafay. You exceeded it by 3 minutes, but we'll try and make it up. Our next speaker, and a very good friend of South Africa, is Henry Louis Marie Castano. He was born in Paris in 1927. He studied law at the University of Sorbonne, Paris, lectured at the HEC in Paris. He's married to Patricia M. Bathbrook of, this will shock you, Eastbourne, Sussex. Am I right, Henry? He's one daughter and 2 sons. Amongst others, he's chairman and managing director of FRANSA, which is the French South African Trade Development Corporation, and also SAPSCOR, South African Petroleum Services, etc., and a host of others. And to cut it short, I'd like to introduce Mr. Henry Castano to you.
Baie dankie, meneer die voorzitter. The creation of any such horizontal entities as the Regional Services Council without doubt offer the private sector not only the opportunity but also the challenge to provide essential services to the public at large. We should, however, have no illusions when examining the mechanisms by which such a service can be transferred from the public to the private sector. We must be aware at all times that many services supplied by the public sector are subsidized, and in other cases the true cost of the service is not always exactly defined due to the accounting procedures adopted by local authorities. In order to answer the challenge from some local authority spokesmen that, I quote, "The provision of services by the private sector must be of equal or higher quality, but of no higher cost," unquote, it is our experience in the Lyonnaise des Eaux group that the private company can only accept such a challenge if the transfer is based on the following principles. The water or refused service must be considered as an industrial and commercial service and no longer as a social service. This means that the charge to the consumer must absolutely include all the operating costs and investment charges. Naturally, all these expenses also apply to all existing services, and although often hidden in the authorities' budget, will need to be taken into account when making any price comparison. The service must be mainly, if not exclusively, financed by the consumers living within the service, and not through an increase in the broad tax burden. At the same time, the consumer must be guaranteed a regular service at the best possible price. The application of these principles requires the creation and application of modern financial arrangements and new technologies. In this situation, the private sector, with its flexible ability to adapt, finds free expression for the greatest benefit to the consumer and taxpayer. It is often mistakenly thought, for instance, that the management of a water service is merely an extension of consulting or contracting activities. In fact, to manage a water service means not only the operation and maintenance of the equipment to ensure a quality product, but also the training of personnel, maintaining customers' relations, and strict utilization of public and private finances. It should also be noted, Mr. Chairman, that in accepting a contract, the private company takes investment risks arising from the political, economic and legal conditions. This makes it essential that medium to long-term contracts are negotiated, since this is the only guarantee of a real and long-lasting transfer of technology and of prices of an economically acceptable level. City and town administration has, over the years, become increasingly complex. The authority must ensure the basic and essential services that are at the very core of a well-run community. It is well recognized that each community is different, and even though the same problem may exist in adjoining towns, no one solution or blueprint can be expected to solve all requirements adequately. There are four basic types of contracts which could be considered in theory, though each of those will need to be modified and adapted to the unique real-world situation. Factors as the following must be considered: size of the municipality, population magnitude and distribution, climate, existing facilities, and service workforce. But the most important of all, of course, is the limitations of the budget, and this ultimately determines the type of arrangement that needs to be established. Having said that, it must be borne in mind that the types of agreement we are looking at are completely flexible. As Mr. Robert Poole intimated to us earlier on, there is a wide variety of possible agreements which generally correspond to four types of contract, namely concession, also known as franchise, lease or farm out, management, and lastly service contracts. And I'd like to briefly discuss these. As I've just said, the final choice of the contract, however, can of course be a combination of two or more of these types. Concession is a long-term franchise type agreement under which the contractor undertakes responsibility for a long-range program, including the cost of rehabilitating existing installations, constructing new facilities, and carrying out day-to-day operations. Upon expiry of the contract, all installations, guaranteed to be in good working orders, of course, revert to the community. In terms of a concession agreement, the responsibility and financial commitment of the contracting party are very high, since the operator, constructor, finances the operating capital and any new works or assets. His income is included in the charge for the service, the cost of which to the consumer is set by the local authority according to the contract. A minimum surcharge is usually added to cover the local authority's expenses, while the consumer is contractually bound to the operator contractor. The lease contract, on the other hand, is similar to the concession agreement, the only difference being that the local authority is responsible for the financing of new works and assets. All other aspects are exactly the same. A management contract, on the other hand, exists when the consumers are clients of the municipality, which is also responsible for any construction or renewal of the facilities. The contractor operates the facilities and is paid a management fee by the municipality. Lastly, in a service contract, the contractor carries out specific tasks. For instance, the refuse collection from a particular area of town, the provision of special toxic waste containers to hospitals and certain industries, and the disposal of such materials, water meter reading and or repair, administrative assistance, personal training, and so on. The period of a contract is generally based on the investment that the contractor must make in terms of equipment, the technical complexity of the service, and the quality of the personnel that must be employed to render the service. Here we could contrast a window cleaning contract, which might be for 6 or 12 months, with an ambulance or waste collection and disposal service that would need to be not less than 3 to 5 years, and water contracts which usually extend from 10 to 30 years. Whatever contract is proposed, the details must be freely discussed between the parties involved, according to a general framework which in some countries is prescribed by the central or provincial government, particularly in the case of water management services. The only demand that a private company can specifically require is that its responsibility is clearly delineated and defined. In all cases, the local authority assumes a supervisory role while the day-to-day provision of the service is conducted by specialists. Now, the rules which in our opinion must govern the award of the contracts are the following. Award enough contracts to avoid excessive reliance on a single supplier and to permit a significant fraction of the bidders to succeed in their search for work, thereby encouraging the losers to try again next time. Make such contracts large enough to allow economies of scale. Award enough contracts so that the administrative burden remains manageable. Ensured, as Dr. Peary said earlier, that contracts are not awarded to small, inexperienced companies, which run the risk of liquidation if they fail to meet their contractual obligations. Handle problems and pay bills promptly to keep service companies interested in holding on to the business. It is also worth noting, in passing, that although competitive bidding is legally required in many cases, and that such a procedure cannot readily be faulted, there is some empirical evidence throughout the world that negotiated contracts lead to prices that are no higher than competitive contracts. Little or no privatization has so far taken place in the provision of water purification, treatment and distribution in this country. The reason given by the authorities for this point in our view towards solutions which only the private sector can offer. One water board we talked to had fixed costs of 16%, whilst 76% of its total costs are loan costs. With a situation like this, even if a private company could streamline the facility and increase the efficiency by 25%, the effect on profits, and thus water prices, would be obviously negligible. Another water board complains that by retaining a low consumer price, their operational budget is by necessity also low, and they cannot therefore improve efficiency. In both these cases, and no doubt in a number of other cases, the situation is not only economically unsound, it is disgraceful. One of the few ways out of this catch-22 situation is to consider the scenario where the water board becomes a proprietary limited company which sells its share on the open market. A point decidedly in favor of this route is that loan accounts are decreased or disappear with the necessity of repayments, while the excessive interest charges now become more realistic dividend payments to shareholders. The employment of a private management company which has access to international expertise and experience in modern techniques and efficiency programs would be the ideal partner to complete this scenario. The message we have for the horizontal entities, such as regional services councils, is that the private sector is willing and able to provide specialized services, and we trust that we will be given the chance to show our capabilities. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would like to repeat a remark attributed to Mr. Gorbachev, which he made during a speech in February this year. He said, and I quote, "The situation called for change, but a peculiar psychology, hard to improve things, without changing anything, took the upper hand in the central bodies and for that matter at local level as well." Unquote. We are hopeful and confident that we in South Africa are not influenced by this same attitude. We trust that the establishment of the regional services councils or any such horizontal entities will assign the private sector with a responsibility to provide essential services in a cost-effective and efficient manner. Baie dankie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castano. Our next and last speaker in this session is Mr. P.S. Steyn, who is a professional engineer. I've got his curriculum vitae here in Afrikaans, so if I translate in reading it incorrectly, please forgive me. He matriculated at the Helpmekaar Boys High School and obtained a BSc Civil Engineering degree at the Pretoria University in 1959. In 1966, he had obtained the MBA at Potch University. From 1960 to 1983, he was attached to the Transvaal Roads Department, where, especially in the past few years, as chief engineer, he was involved in road construction throughout the Transvaal province. Since 1983, he is now the director of the Transvaal Works Department. This paper is a summary of the DBA thesis which he submitted to Potchefstroom University with Professor Dr. T. Elof as his promoter. Mr. Steyn, please.
Baie dankie meneer die voorsitter vir daardie woorde. Meneer die voorsitter, ek het my referaat in Afrikaans voorberei en ek gaan hom ook in Afrikaans lewer. Ek dink dit sal goed genoeg wees vir ons buitelandse gaste dat in die opsomming aan die einde van die dag daar dan miskien 'n opsomming ook sal wees van hierdie gedeelte van die verrigtinge. Dames en here, ek wil baie nou aansluit by die referaat van meneer Kees Legaai en ek wil die saak nou net so 'n klein bietjie verder neem deur dan vir u so 'n bietjie van 'n gevallestudie te behandel. Hierdie gevallestudie handel dan oor die Transvaalse Paaie Departement, waar daar vandag nog 'n baie groot gedeelte van die werk deur departementele spanne gedoen word. Net om u so 'n bietjie agtergrond te gee, vandat die eerste kontrakte hier in die 50er jare deur die Paaie Departement uitgegee is tot omtrent 1970, was die verhouding, as 'n mens nou kyk na die totale fondse beskikbaar vir konstruksiewerk, was 60% toegewys aan departementele spanne en so wat 40% aan kontrakte. In die opbloeijare van 1970 tot 1979 en met die geweldige groot aanbouprogram van die deurpadnetwerk, het hierdie persentasie verander in 40% departementeel en 60% kontrakte. Met die moeiliker jare sedert 1979 het hierdie persentasie nou weer teruggekeer na die aanvanklike, naamlik 60% toegewys aan departementele spanne en net 40% aan die kontrakte. En dit is die ding wat meneer Legaai ook onder andere vroeër hier genoem het, een van die probleme. Nou dames en here, om nou te probeer om 'n vergelyking te maak tussen departementele en kontrakkoste is 'n baie moeilike saak. Vir die eenvoudige rede dat dit baie moeilik is in die eerste instansie om gemeenskaplike meeteenhede te kry. Omdat die kostesisteme, soos vir kontrakte in die tenderdokumente, hoeveelheidslyste, baie verskil van die departementele kostesisteem wat 'n baie vereenvoudigde kostesisteem is. Dis die een probleem. Die tweede probleem, dames en here, is dan om die talle indirekte kostes en bo-kostes waar daarna ook alreeds verwys is, in die geval van die departementele spanne, om die te verbesonder na die werklike koste van die pad. In hierdie gevallestudie wat ek met u gaan behandel, is dit dan juis 'n poging om van hierdie vergelykingsbasisse so te kry dat 'n mens wel 'n vergelyking kan maak. Kortliks net dit wil ek daarby sê, dames en here, dat om u 'n idee te gee van die indirekte kostes wat 'n mens kon identifiseer in die geval van die departementele spanne, laat die gemiddelde daarvan so hoog is as 31%. In die geval van die kontrakte het die indirekte kostes hier in die orde van 5% beloop. Nou wil ek, net voordat ek daar na die skuifie-projekte toe gaan en vir u die resultate by wyse van skuifies vinnig te wys, net vir u 'n baie rowwe idee gee van hoe die koste van 'n pad opgemaak word deur die 5 of 6 hoofkomponente. Ek gaan dit afrond en om dit vir u makliker te maak om dit net vlug te onthou. Die voorbereidingswerk, die koste verbonde aan voorbereidingswerk voordat jy kan begin met die bou van die pad, is in die orde van 8%, kom ons sê maar 10% om dit 'n ronde syfer te maak. Die dreineringskoste is in die omgewing van 10%. Die padfondamentkoste, die beloop 60%. So jy sien, dit is waar die groot koste lê. Die beteringskoste is ook in die omgewing van 10%, en dan die finale afwerkingskoste soortgelyk ook in die omgewing van 10%. Dames en here, dan gaan ek nou vir u net vanaf 'n klompie van die skyfies wys om vir 'n idee te gee, gebaseer op hierdie kostekomponente wat ek nou vir u geïdentifiseer het, hoe die vergelykende koste tussen departementele en kontrakkoste is vir hierdie paar aspekte. Dames en here, dit is nou die eerste ene, die voorbereidingskoste. Net om u 'n idee te gee daar, hierdie is die resultate van 10 jaar se kontrakte van die Paaidepartement en ook van al hulle departementele kostes. Is hy beter so? Hierdie is die voorbereidingskoste vir enkelbaanpaaie en u moet asseblief die ding sien as tendense. Mense moet dit liewer sien bloot as tendense. U kan daar sien dat die departementele spanne se voorbereidingskoste aansienlik laer neig as die van die kontrakte. Daar's goeie redes voor. Ek gaan nou nie baie diep daarop indelwe nie. Die belangrikste is dat die departementele koste merendeel in die plattelandse gebiede werksaam is, waar die voorbereidingswerk minder is as op die moeiliker stedelike deurpaaie. Daar is vir u 'n tendens, die tendens by die dreineringskoste. Steeds is die departementele koste laer as die kontrakkoste, maar u kan sien dat daar 'n neiging is dat die twee nader beweeg aan mekaar. Dames en here, die ene is 'n interessante ene. Dit is die kompaksiekoste en as u kan reg onthou, het ek gesê die padfondamentkoste is omtrent so 60% van die totale koste. As 'n mens net dat die kompaksiekoste kyk, dis omtrent 50%. En hier het 'n mens die eienaardige verskynsel dat daar 'n sterk neiging is dat die departementele koste aansienlik hoër neig as die van die kontrakkoste. Daar is iets soortgelyks vir die stabilisasiekoste. In hierdie geval is die kontrakkoste weer laer as die departementele koste. Daardie een is vir klipslagkoste in gevalle waar mense padfondamente met klipslag bou. Kontrakkoste is bietjie laer, althans bietjie hoër as die departementele koste. Daar is vir die voorstelling van beteringskoste. Die twee onderste lyne is vir wat ons ken as gewone dubbelseels, waar die twee kostes baie na mekaar is. Die boonste is maar net ingetrek vir interessantheidshalwe. Dit is vir 50 mm asfalt. Nou die departementele spanne maak normaalweg nie van asfalt gebruik, so ons het nie 'n koste daarvoor nie. Dan is daar een vir die afwerkingskoste. Jy sal onthou, ek het ook gesê, dis ook in die orde van 10% van die totale koste. Net soos die voorbereidingskoste is die afwerkingskoste aansienlik laer vir die departementele spanne. As 'n mens nou verder gaan en jy probeer nou om die hele wat by mekaar te gooi en jy probeer een meeteenheid te kry en 'n totale kostesyfer te kry vir alle paaie, is daar gebruik gemaak van die begrip van 'n ekwivalente kubieke meter, waar volgens die kompaksie, stabilisasie en klipslagkostes omgewerk is in 'n ekwivalente kubieke meter. En dit is dan die resultaat van daardie berekeninge. Interessante is dat in die totaal hier in die jare 1979-80 ongeveer, wat dit voorkom asof die totale koste van die departementele spanne die van die kontrakte beginne verbysteek het. In die jaar 84-85 is dit in die orde van 9%. Dit klink daar 'n bietjie baie laag as die syfers wat ons van ons oorseese gaste gehoor het in hulle ondervinding. Maar u sal opmerk dat daar 'n stygende neiging is. Net om die saak daarom so 'n bietjie in perspektief te stel, dit is nie al die eenhede wat swak vaar nie, net om vir u daar enetjie te wys. Dit is van die 3 departementele eenhede hier op die Witwatersrand. As 'n mens nou hulle individuele kostes vergelyk met die gemiddelde van die kontrakte, die totale gemiddelde van die kontrakte, dan merk jy op dat al 3 van hulle besonder swak vaar. Vergelyk 'n mens dit met Pietersburg eenhede in die platteland, dan alhoewel die Pietersburg eenhede oor die laaste rukkie begin swakker vaar het, is daar nie 'n noemenswaardige verskil tussen die twee nie. Kyk 'n mens byvoorbeeld na 'n eenheid soos die eenheid by Rustenburg, wat 'n besondere hoë produksiepyl handhaaf, sal jy opmerk dat in daardie geval vaar die eenheid eintlik beter as wat die kontrakteurs vaar. Ek glo daar seker veel meer tyd oor nie. Dit gee u dan die gevalle studie bloot te sien uit 'n koste-oogpunt. Daar mag in die aard van die saak by so 'n departement wat departementele eenhede bedryf ook ander redes wees as bloot koste, redes waarom hy die spanne aanhou. Dankie meneer die voorsitter.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 8 minutes for questions and the same procedures in the first session. First question, please. Mr. Peary.
I would like to ask a question about the costing
of the public service, we find it extremely difficult to get a municipal government to give an accurate costing of their service. Some of them do not include the cost of administration, recruitment, personnel management, buildings, maintenance, the interest which is foregone on the capital they spend, and some of them, even when evaluating waste disposal, didn't include wages. When we receive these costings, we place them on the fiction shelves of our libraries. I would like to ask what steps are taken to make sure that the actual costing provided by the department is a genuine one and takes account of the same factors that a private business would.
You can use the mic on the desk there. That one's working. Who's going to answer this? Mr. Stein. Would Mr. Murray please join us also on the dais? Mr. Gil Murray, please. Eric, you're going to answer. Mr. Hall.
I shouldn't answer because I fully agree. The reason why the answer is not given is because it's not known. Once one has that complex system of accounting, I had, for instance, in 14 different branches of my department, overheads, which were supposed to include personal overheads plus office and other direct overheads, and they varied from 25% in one branch to 150% in another, with no explanation.
Next question, please. Gentleman here, just give us your name for record purposes.
Mr. Chairman, Western Development Board. Mr. Chairman, I would like to make an observation which I think will be of interest to the audience and also to our overseas visitors. About 6 years ago, the government decided to upgrade the essential service in Soweto at a total cost of about 500 million rand. Now, in order to expedite the planning, which would have taken normally a couple of years, we enlisted the services of the civil engineering consultants, civil engineering contractors, the CSIR, Johannesburg Municipality, ourselves, the Department of Roads, and then those plans were drawn up in about 6 months, and the work actually started before all the plans were finished. Because we were able, through the Transvaal Roads Department and Mr. Piet Stein here was the coordinator eventually, to get the work underway. Now, that's the observation. The question is, could not in future, particularly now, in regard to the urbanization, where it will be necessary for us to accommodate about 7 million people over the next 20 years or 15 years, will it not be possible to follow a similar procedure? The civil engineering contractors and consultants, who are the people who should be busiest now, are sitting without work in this period of economic recession. And if the land could be made available now, these people could get busy so that when the actual work, the construction of houses comes along, that work would be completed. Is that not possible? I would like to ask the question either to Dr. Perry or to Mr. Wood.
Thank you. Dr. Perry, would you be prepared? Mr. Poole, would you like to give us your view?
It's a bit difficult to know some of the technical feasibility because of not knowing enough about the local constraints, particularly the fiscal constraints. But it sounds as if this would be an excellent opportunity to move forward, to actively involve the private sector in getting these urbanization programs going on a timely basis. And if indeed you have a lot of unused private sector capability at this point in time, to get those people involved, to get contracts let on a timely basis would certainly seem to make sense.
Thank you, Mr. Poole. Any other questions? The lady over here. Just give us your name, please.
Thank you. I'm Councillor Graham of the Johannesburg City Council. I have, I think, a disquiet, a worry of a human need, and I don't want any answers on this one, but I just want to draw attention to it, so that when you're discussing how to go from the local option to privatisation, this is not forgotten. We, sir, in the City Council employ a very large number of people. And I have seen major companies in this town in these economic times do exactly what Dr. Perry suggested, which I go with. The incentive basis, move sideways, be absorbed somewhere else. But you can only do that that, sir, if you own a house and you live in it and you are not on the contract labour system. Now, we in the council employ thousands of people. We house them, we provide them with health, pension schemes, recreational facilities, and in fact, so comfortable are they in many instances to be able to send money home to support thousands of other people in areas which are desperate. I draw attention to Kwakwa, where we are employing now women, and when I saw the work we're being given, sweeping of streets, and I spoke to them and said, are you happy for that? They said, yes, we want the money. No way, sir, can we neglect or put these people out of work. Are we then, the council, going to become an employment agency so that all these thousands of people will be absorbed through the new change of direction? Are the people who are going to work with them and use them going to pay us for those services? How is it going to be administered? I don't want one single member of the council employment staff to be put out of work or hurt in any way. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that contribution. Time for one more. The gentleman here on the left-hand side.
I would like to ask Mr. Castano if he could provide us with some examples of what has been done elsewhere in the field that he was talking about, and particularly as far as savings are concerned.
Could we just have your name, please?
Eustace Daly, Administrative Director, Free Market Foundation.
Thank you.
I would go, answering the second part of the question first, I would go with Dr. Peary and support his view that the savings are of the order of 20 to 40%. In France, where our group is based, number one, the two systems, public sector management and private sector management, cohabit very happily. In addition to that, in the field of water services, there are two very large groups, ours being one of them, but there is also a fairly large number of regional, if not local, companies. So the concern for competition is certainly not there. There is plenty of competition. Now, abroad, I'm pleased to tell Mr. Poole that we control a fairly large American company called General Water Works, and we're certainly going great guns in the privatization of water distribution services. And there are a large number of examples I could quote. I think that the most possibly attractive one is a very recent one. We just took over the city of Macau in Southeast Asia, where the system was in very poor condition. We've been given a 30 years contract there, and we are rehabilitating completely the reticulation, and an article which I've just received says that the population is extremely happy not to see not only leaks but sometimes geysers in the streets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we've come to the end of this session, and I assume that towards the conclusion of this conference, Councillor Ricky Valenti and Mr. Leon Lowe will no doubt express some views of thanks to all the organizers. But may I take this opportunity on your behalf to thank most warmly the last four speakers for the excellent and professional way in which they put across their views in such a very limited space of time. Let us give them the usual acclamation. Thank you also for the speakers in assisting me in making up a little bit of time, and may I conclude by saying that we adjourn for tea and pleased to start moving back into this conference hall at about 25 past 10 so that we can start promptly at 11:30. And may I once again thank the organizers for organizing me to chair this second session. Thank you very much.
gentlemen, can we settle? We are running out of time.
Oh, wow. I think I've got to do something here.
Well, morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Makana Chabalala, President of the Soweto Chamber of Commerce and Industries. I wish to welcome you all to this very historic gathering. I wish to thank our speakers for coming before they speak, because I know it's going to be a very exciting experience and a very exciting exercise, especially my session, which concerns refuse collection. Without wasting much time, I want to reintroduce Mr. Poole, Bob Poole. And I think in the first session, Bob Poole was adequately, introduced to you. And without wasting much time, I'll call on Mr. Poole to give his talk. Give him a hand, please.
I've been asked in this session to give you an overview of the three areas, the American experience with privatizing refuse collection, cleansing, and parks. And I'll try to cover each area as briefly as possible and let you know where we stand with privatizing. Before coming to South Africa, I asked our local government center director to go through our computerized database, which, as I said, lists 27,000 specific instances of local privatization, and calculate the extent of privatization in each of these areas. And so I'll give you those figures as we go along. These are figures now as of the end of 1985. In the area of refuse collection, 50% of U.S. cities now use the private sector for residential refuse collection, either by contracting with a single private firm, by franchising a firm to operate, or by leaving to the private sector entirely. And in commercial refuse collection, 63% of U.S. Local authorities use the private sector in one of those ways. Now, there are four primary methods in which private enterprise is used in refuse collection in America. The first is the most limited. It's called opting out. And by that I mean that the city continues to operate a refuse collection service, but allows certain large groups of customers to choose their own private provider instead. This might be an apartment complex, a neighborhood that has a neighborhood association that agrees to take the responsibility for refuse collection itself. They are allowed to hire their own firm, and in some cases, but not all, they get a rebate on a portion of their property taxes that otherwise would have gone to finance refuse collection, because they are relieving the city of the responsibility in their particular area for doing that. This is not an extremely common method, but it is used in a number of cities. The second, and probably the most common form of privatization of refuse collection, is the contracting out method that I discussed earlier this morning. The city goes out to bid, selects a particular private firm to provide the service, and often in the case of contracting out, the city will continue to do the billing of customers for the monthly charge for garbage collection. In some cases, in the case of a large city, it may divide the city up into a number of districts and separately go out to bid in each of those districts. And it may even retain, as Dr. Peary mentioned, some capability. It may retain one district out of 5 with the city providing the service and go out to bid with private enterprise in the other 4. and this way there's a diversity of providers, and if any one provider should have a problem, it's very easy to, you already have other providers that you're dealing with or the city's own service to go and take over. The third form of private refuse collection is called franchise, and this is slightly different from the contract model. In a franchise situation, the local authority simply licenses a private firm to be the garbage provider in a certain area, either the whole city or a portion of the city. Sometimes it may license more than one, but in the franchise situation, typically the firm itself does the billing of customers rather than the local authority. In the final situation, the final form of privatization is called the open entry model. And in this case, the local government just simply says, picking up refuse is not going to be our responsibility any longer. We are going to allow the free market to work, and any firm that wishes to be in business can enter the garbage collection business. People choose their own provider, and the advantage of this model is that, in fact, garbage collection, although we may laugh about it a little, is a service which has some different characteristics. It's not the same, everyone doesn't want the same quality or level of garbage collection. Some people might want garbage picked up from their backyard, others are willing to move their garbage out to the sidewalk and perhaps pay a slightly lower price for having done that amount of work themselves. The frequency of pickup is another variable. Some people want twice-a-week collection, others are satisfied with once a week. So in fact, there are different demands for garbage pickup that can be met by different firms. So it is a situation in which competition makes sense, with users providing the type of users picking the type of service at the type of price that they want to pay. Now, a question that comes up is, what if someone chooses not to have their garbage picked up? This is an objection that's raised to the open entry model. And the answer to that is simply that you have to obviously have enforcement of public health laws. No one may be allowed to create a public health hazard by not having his garbage picked up. And so you must have strong public health enforcement in order to have the open entry model so that no one creates this kind of a problem. Now, what are the savings from privatization? Earlier this morning I mentioned there was a nationwide study. This one was conducted by the National Science Foundation in 1975 and 1976. They surveyed 1,400 communities nationwide in the United States and compared these forms of private versus municipal garbage collection. They found that in cities smaller than 20,000 population, there weren't really very strong differences in cost between public and private. But once you got beyond larger than 20,000, and especially once you got larger than 50,000 population, there were very large differences in cost. On a fully allocated basis, when you actually take all the costs of municipal collection into account, including many of the costs, as Dr. Peary mentioned, that local governments often ignore, like the cost of the pension system, the cost of capital equipment, the cost of a share of the city overhead, you put all those costs into the ledger and compare them with the prices charged by private enterprise, the difference was 68% on a fully allocated basis between public and private. So we're not talking about small cost savings made possible here. There were some important differences between public and private that showed up in this survey. The absentee rate for municipal refuse collection services was 12%. In private enterprise, it was 7.5%. The average size of the pickup crew was 3 people per truck in the public sector, 2 people per truck in the private sector, to do the same amount of work, mind you. And so forth on down the line. The private sector used about 25% larger capacity truck, which means that it has to spend less time going back and forth to the dump. All the factors that lead to higher productivity were there in the private sector, not because of any special knowledge that the private sector has, but simply because the incentives are much stronger. The incentives of not having the business unless you do a cost-effective job. A similar study took place just a year ago in Canada, nationwide across the country in Canada, done by the University of Victoria in British Columbia. They found that there was approximately 50% higher cost in municipal refuse collection compared to private enterprise collection. So our recommendation, after looking at these studies for many years, is that the best way to go in privatizing refuse is with the open entry model if you have adequate public health enforcement so that you aren't creating the risk of public health problems. That it depoliticizes the service entirely, it allows consumers the maximum choice, lets people choose different level of service at a different price, and tailor it to individual needs. The second best way to go is the franchise model, where you allow one or more private firms to, under specified controlled conditions, to pick up the garbage in a given city or part of the city, with the users paying the bills directly to the companies. Now let me move on quickly to cleaning services. We asked our computer to what extent has street sweeping been privatized in the United States. This hasn't gone as far or as fast as some other forms. Only 9% of the local authorities have privatized their street sweeping services, and this has only really been occurring in the last 5 years. Building maintenance, another form of cleaning the public buildings, 20% of local governments currently contract that out. Both of these, street sweeping and building maintenance, because they're city housekeeping services, the contract out model is really the only form of privatization that we find. Both of these have been studied, comparing public and private. The consulting firm of Ecodata did a study on street sweeping. They looked at 10 Southern California cities with municipal street sweeping and 10 with contracted out street sweeping. As I mentioned this result briefly earlier this morning, they found it was 43% more costly for government to do it itself than to contract it out. And they looked at, there were all sorts of things that turned up, more efficient management, better use of personnel, more modern equipment. For example, the municipal street sweeping operations averaged 1 supervisor for every 8 workers. The private enterprise averaged 1 supervisor for every 12 workers. Now that's one part of coming up with that 43% cost difference, and there were many other similar factors of that sort. Now, who are the providers of street sweeping services? Some of the providers are subsidiaries, specialized subsidiaries of large nationwide refuse collection companies. This has been an area of specialization that the major refuse collection companies have started to develop. It's a natural add-on to the business of picking up garbage. But others are small local firms that have found that although there are high capital costs of the street sweeping equipment, that this is a business that they can do. It doesn't require great technical expertise. So you have both local and subsidiaries of national firms doing it. Last year, these firms got together, 150 of them formed a national trade association, even called the National Contract Sweepers Association, and they have started doing things like providing sample contracts and bidding specifications and the procedures, performance bond agreements, all the kind of things that make it easy for a local authority to decide to go out. As Dr. Peary said, you don't have to reinvent all these procedures from scratch. You can use ready-made forms and procedures and protocols and just adapt them to your own circumstances. And certainly these would be available to local authorities in South Africa as a starting point to work from. Some of these are also available from an organization called the American Public Works Association. In janitorial service, the same consulting firm, Ecodata, study comparing public versus private, found 73% more costly to have municipal governments providing their own janitorial service rather than contracting with the private sector. We've seen examples. One of the most dramatic examples of large-scale contracting out of building cleaning is the World Trade Center in New York. If you've been there or seen pictures, there are these 2 huge towers that are taller than anything else in New York City. Those are actually public buildings. They're owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which runs the airports and many of the toll bridges, and they also have built this huge project. They contract out that entire maintenance service, cleaning the buildings, The firm that currently has the contract is ISS, International Service System, which is a Danish multinational that's one of the largest contract cleaning firms in the world. For the particular World Trade Center contract, they had 850 employees doing that job. And all of those people were formerly employees of the Port Authority, who were taken on because they already knew the building, they knew how to do it, but they now work for the private company instead. The Port Authority itself has 18 inspectors who monitor the work done by those 850 employees and hold them to very exacting standards. And the contract has all sorts of penalty clauses. If things are not cleaned just so, then the company is penalized by certain dollar amounts. And so they find that the standards are met about 98% of the time. Again, there's a trade association, the Building Service Contractors Association, that has developed some model specifications and bidding procedures. So once again, any local authority that wants to start contracting out this service does not have to start at ground zero. They can start with existing information and knowledge that already is there. And janitorial service in public buildings is an ideal business that small local companies can get into. It requires very little capital. People don't have to have college degrees. So it's a very easy business to get started in privatization with. Finally, we have parks. We asked our computer again, to what extent have parks and recreational services of local governments been privatized? Well, there were 3 different cases we looked at. The operation of recreational facilities, such as golf courses, 24% of local authorities have contracted out some or all of those services. The maintenance and landscaping of parks has been contracted out by 16%, and the providing of recreational programs in local facilities has been privatized to some extent or another in 40% of local communities across the United States. Contracting park maintenance has been studied, compared public and private, and it was found that maintaining street trees is 37% more costly when done by local authorities, and cutting the grass in parks and other public spaces is 43% more costly when done by local authorities. In California, following the tax limitation measure, Proposition 13, that passed in 1978, there was not very much park and recreation contracting prior to that. 1 year later, 81% of the local governments were using private sector contracts for some or all of those programs in order to cope with the tax limitations imposed by Proposition 13. Here again, the maintenance efforts, maintaining trees, grass, this is another ideal startup business that has very low capital requirements. You don't need a college degree in order to get into that business. There are probably already in many cities are lots of firms in the landscaping business. So it's very easy to find suppliers. It's very easy to get new firms to be created to provide these services. Operating whole facilities is a relatively recent trend in the United States, but one that's growing rapidly. Golf courses in particular have been privatized. Many municipal golf courses have been allowed to get run down over the years. They haven't been operated in a very business-like fashion. They charge below market prices. They're not kept up well. The facilities are lacking. Some of them don't even have pro shops to sell things. They don't have snack bars or bars. And so there's quite a market now that's been created for private firms to come along and on a long-term basis make something like a 20 or a 30-year contract to take over the entire operation of the golf course and make it into a moneymaker for the city. And they guarantee a minimum amount of income to the city each year, and they also agree to put a certain amount of capital resource into refurbishing and the golf courses. New York City has done this, Philadelphia has done this, so it's not just small cities, but it's major American cities. The city of Pittsburgh is in the process of selling its baseball stadium to private investors so that the city doesn't have to come up with the capital cost of refurbishing that stadium. Finally, recreational programs. We've seen quite a growth of contracting not only with for-profit agencies and firms, but also with nonprofit organizations to operate recreation programs in public facilities. For example, a local soccer league or a baseball club will get a contract with the local authority to maintain the baseball field very often at a much lower cost than it would have been to use public employees, because the members of the club will do a lot of the work voluntarily. And so this is an easy way to reduce the cost to the local government. And there are handbooks now available in the United States on how to use volunteers, how to use the private sector in operating and maintaining recreation programs and facilities. So to sum up, we've had extensive experience in America in all three of these areas of refuse, cleansing, and parks. Not only are there numerous firms in the business, but there are detailed specifications and provisions that could be available to South African local authorities or to South African businesses that give you a head start on doing privatization here in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. We actually see ourselves in the black townships, taking over the cleaning of the townships. We find there is a total breakdown, and one of the things that seem to be the good reason is the uprisings, so I'm told. But in fact, it is because I think the people want all the services privatized, and everybody is not getting the message. I hope you've given the message today. Thank you very much again, Bob. Our next speaker is Mr. Lombard, and he'll be speaking on waste management services. Mr. Lombard was born in May 1948 in Bloemfontein, and I see here you've got your ID number, and it looks like you're just ready to carry your pass, but I'm not going to mention it because people are not going to worry about that. And he matriculated in Kitwe in Zambia, and he's married in 1972, has got a BSc degree in chemistry and botany in Natal, in Pietermaritzburg, 1970, MBL 4 at UNISA. His career is quite long, but Mr. Lombard has been involved quite a lot in waste management. So he's got tremendous experience. I wouldn't like to go to all the things that he's done, because we have to conserve some time, Mr. Lombard. I'll call on Mr. Lombard to present his paper. Thank you.
Is it on now? Right, it is. I think we've got a controller at the back there. I'm sorry about that long CV, but when they ask for a CV, you're never quite sure what exactly it is that they want. Now, I've got to talk about privatisation of waste management services in South Africa. And I think that with Regional Services Council's Act in focus and the Environment Conservation Act, Act 100 of 1982 in focus, I think you'll all agree with me that it's become an increasingly complex field. I borrowed a little comic strip here from the Cape Times, 4th of December 1980, which I thought was quite prescient. It says, waste collection and disposal is no longer considered the job of any fool. With a lorry, a strong pair of hands and a hole in the ground, say the experts. I think you also need a hole in the head. Now, I'm unfortunately going to have to repeat some of the material that's gone up ahead of us, particularly Mr. Perry's material and Dr. Perry's material and Mr. Gould's material, because when you prepare papers in isolation, you often find that this sort of thing happens. One of the first things we have is a problem of perceptions that can be misleading. And the private sector and public sector debate has been going on for a considerable period of time. The public sector perceives the private sector as being cheaper, perhaps initially, but it's more expensive in the long run. It sees the private sector as a bunch of rapists. It's concerned about monopolies and collusion. And even if they grant contracts, they're worried about the private sector companies going bankrupt. Just in the same way that the private sector has some misgivings about the public sector, it perceives them as a bunch of empire builders. It's worried about dishonest costing, and it's worried about vested interests. What is the reality? We need to go overseas and have a look at some of the experiences. The United States of America, you've heard Rob Poole talk about the alternatives looked at: municipal service, contract service, a franchise service where you have a number of different contractors operating in the same city, perhaps in different areas of the city. Totally private, which they now indicate seems to be the most cost effective, although a previous publication of his indicated that contract and franchise were the least costly schemes for cities of all sizes overall. The economic ethic in the United States of America seems to favour privatisation. That's something one must understand right at the outset. There are many small contractors. In fact, in the States, private contractors collect residential refuse in plus minus twice as many cities as municipal agencies do. They're able to overcome political and bureaucratic problems. There's far less red tape for them. They can cross municipal boundaries without any difficulties at all. The services are funded in the States largely by user charges. And an interesting thing that has come up is that many cities in the States do not have adequate staff for adequate maintenance of very, very expensive vehicles. I think if you have a look at ourselves here in South Africa, we have a similar problem. A tremendous skill shortage. And lastly, the private sector has been instrumental in forging ahead, pioneering waste to energy technology, recycling technology, and a whole host of waste reducing technologies. Let's have a look at the United Kingdom. And this information may be out of date, in line with Dr. Perry's latest information, but municipal cleansing contracts awarded to private contractors as at February 1986, so with my source of information, was 24. But there are 45 other English and 6 other Welsh local authorities who use private contractors to assist them. In all cases, indisputable savings were achieved by contracting out. Have a look at this. The contractors' tenders totaled £6.2 million, whereas municipal estimates for the same contracts were £7.9 million. That's a 22% saving. That's that 20 to 40% ballpark that they were talking about early on. Have a look at the distribution of contracts awarded amongst the private contractors. The number of companies operating in the field are 9 to date of the publication of this particular bit of information. And the percentage of contracts, the split is one contractor has 50% of the contracts, 2 23%, 1 8%, and 5 19%. So you can see it does attract a fair number of competitors. They've gone so far in the United Kingdom to actually publish a green paper called Competition and the Provision of Local Authority Services. I understand from discussing with Dr. Perry last night that this may not come about before the next general election in England because of time constraints that they're facing. But what this green paper says, as of April 1987, all local authorities will go to tender for refuse, street cleansing, building and ground maintenance and catering. All will be contracted out over a period of 3 years, and a policing system will be introduced to ensure fair play. That indicates to what extent the British government have responded to the obvious savings that they've seen in the system. And it also indicates government intervention, whereas in the United States of America there seems to be very little government intervention. Let's have a look at Australia. Australia is perhaps a bit closer to ourselves here. The Waste Disposal Act of 1970 gave rise to the formation of Metropolitan Waste Disposal Authorities. Sydney started up in 1979, and they provide waste disposal facilities, recycling facilities, a control system which controls the waste from cradle to grave, and an advisory service on waste handling inside industrial premises, also obviously for the local boroughs within the Greater Sydney area. But what is interesting is that notwithstanding providing a regionalised infrastructure, The infrastructure is managed by private contractors who tender for 5-year contracts. Now bear in mind, the Metropolitan Waste Disposal Authority of Sydney is a statutory body, but it makes a profit of $4.5 million on a turnover of $17.5 million, and that's a 26% profit rate, which would be very attractive to anybody in private enterprise, never mind a statutory governing body. How is Sydney organised? Through the MWDA. There are 2 major transfer stations and 6 regional landfill sites. From a situation where they had very few contractors, they've got 6 contractors operating there. Recycling, which is the buzzword in the waste management industry at this point in time, takes place at the transfer stations. Notice they even recycle those PET bottles, those 2-litre Coke bottles. How does Sydney fund itself? User-related charges. The polluter pays. And you can see that the rates vary anywhere from $9.40 a tonne to $22 a tonne. If you use a transfer station, it's more expensive. And obviously the logistics justify it because the transfer stations are at the furthest points from the disposal sites. There are annual licensing fees, registration fees for transporters, depots, landfills, premises, and people, all in the waste management industry. So it's not a general levy that's raised over everybody in a local authority area or in a metro area. It's user related. In summary again, just have a look at the situation. The USA is a free market. Small businesses do seem to predominate, and when I mean small businesses, I mean small businesses, family-sized businesses, husband and wife team and their family, husband driving the truck, the wife doing the bookkeeping. But they're also large businesses because it's become big business over there. So privatisation is very strong. It's built into their economic ethic. In the UK, there seem to be few large contractors. The local authorities are orientated towards contracts. Australia, similar to the UK in many respects, but that Metropolitan Waste Disposal Authority has many elements in common with our own Regional Services Council Act, insofar as waste management is concerned. We remember that the Regional Services Council Act makes particular reference to waste disposal. It doesn't discuss waste collection, but that doesn't mean that waste collection is totally isolated from privatisation. What do we have in South Africa at this stage? There are quite a few local authorities that are out to contract already. In the Cape there are 8, in the Tel there are 11, in the Transvaal 4, and in the Oranje Vrystaat ons weer terug nie. There's been a proliferation of contractors as soon as the doors opened. It's quite amazing. WasteTech, which was the national pioneer in the industry on the private side, has been followed by Waste Services, Wasteman, Wayne Refuse, other smaller ones in Natal, Collards, Spurwing, and there are a host of opportunistic private cottage contractors. And if that's not enough for you, if you're concerned about the fact that there might be a lack of competition and that there might be collusion, the large multinationals are lurking in the wings. BFI, that's Brown and Ferris Industries in the States, one of their big multinationals, has been to South Africa on a number of occasions, as has Biffa, which is part of British Electric Traction. People know about United Transport in this country. Waste Management Incorporated, another big American, and CETA, which is a company that has managed France, for instance the city of Paris in France, for many, many years, has also had a look at South Africa. They send their spies out regularly to see what's happening. So if the doors open, these people are likely to show a considerable amount of interest in South Africa. Well, it's still a question mark. Is it good news or is it bad news? What I find interesting is that contracting by private contractors to local authorities works even in so-called socialist countries. So why doesn't it get off the ground here? And lastly, I hope that at the end of today's conference, this hardy perennial debate about private sector versus public sector may be laid to rest. Thank you very much.